Grizzly tears apart, 19-year-old hiker in Glacier National Park. The morning of May 21st, 2025, dawned crisp and clear over Glacier National Park, with temperatures hovering around 42 degrees Fahrenheit as the sun crested the Continental Divide. Rachel Marie Turner adjusted the straps of her forest green Osprey backpack for the third time in 10 minutes, her nervous energy palpable as she stood in the parking area at Logan Pass. At 19 years old, she possessed the kind of infectious enthusiasm that drew people to her like moths to flame. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail that caught the early morning light, and her hazel eyes sparkled with anticipation as she surveyed the towering peaks surrounding them. Rachel was a sophomore at the University of Montana studying environmental science, and this trip to Glacier represented more than just a weekend adventure. It was her chance to experience firsthand the ecosystem she'd been studying in Professor Martinez's advanced ecology course. Standing beside her, Marcus Chen checked his camera equipment with the methodical precision of someone who'd learned the hard way that preparation prevented disaster. At 24, Marcus had already established himself as a promising nature photographer, with several publications in National Geographic and Outside magazine. His compact frame belied his strength, built from years of hauling heavy camera gear through challenging terrain. Marcus had grown up in Seattle, the son of Taiwanese immigrants who'd initially been baffled by their son's decision to pursue photography instead of the engineering career they'd envisioned. But after seeing his work featured in a Time magazine spread on climate change, they'd come to understand that his art served a purpose beyond mere documentation. It was advocacy through visual storytelling. The third member of their small hiking party was Sarah Elizabeth Hoffman, a 28-year-old graduate student in wildlife biology from Colorado State University. Sarah had been studying grizzly bear behavior patterns for her doctoral dissertation, focusing specifically on human-bear interactions in high-traffic areas of national parks. Her research had brought her to Glacier for a 2-week field study, and she'd connected with Rachel and Marcus through a hiking forum where she'd posted about looking for companions for day hikes. Sarah's expertise in bear behavior had made her the natural leader of their group, though she wore that responsibility lightly, preferring to share knowledge through casual conversation rather than lecturing. The Hidden Lake Trail they planned to hike was considered one of Glacier's premier wildlife viewing opportunities, a 2.7-mile round-trip boardwalk and trail that climbed approximately 460 feet through alpine meadows to an overlook above Hidden Lake. The trail was known for its spectacular mountain goat sightings, wildflower displays, and panoramic views of the Continental Divide. What made it particularly appealing to Sarah was its reputation as an area where grizzly bears were frequently observed, though typically at distances that posed no threat to properly cautious hikers. As they prepared to set out, other groups were assembling in the parking area, creating a small community of outdoor enthusiasts united by their shared destination. The Kawashima family, Hiroshi, Keiko, and their teenage son Taro, had traveled from Japan specifically to experience American wilderness. Hiroshi, a software engineer from Tokyo, had been planning this trip for over 2 years, meticulously researching trails and wildlife viewing opportunities. His wife Keiko, an elementary school teacher, carried a small notebook where she recorded observations about plants and animals for her students back home. 17-year-old Taro was less enthusiastic about the educational aspects of the trip, but had brought along a professional-grade video camera, hoping to capture footage for his YouTube channel. Another group consisted of the Andersons, long-time visitors to Glacier who'd been making annual pilgrimage trips to the park for over 15 years. Robert Anderson, a retired forest ranger from Oregon, possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of the park's history and ecology. His wife Margaret, a retired high school biology teacher, shared his passion for nature education and often served as an impromptu guide for other visitors they encountered. At 68 and 66 respectively, they moved with the steady, measured pace of experienced hikers who understood that endurance mattered more than speed. The final group preparing for the Hidden Lake Trail that morning included Dr. James Whitmore, an orthopedic surgeon from Denver who was hiking alone, seeking solitude after a difficult divorce, and Elena Rodriguez, a park ranger conducting her routine trail assessment. Elena had been working at Glacier for 8 years, having transferred from Yellowstone after completing her degree in park recreation. She was known for her ability to balance visitor safety with wildlife protection, often serving as a mediator when conflicts arose between human recreation and animal habitat needs. At 7:15 a.m., the temperature had climbed to 46 degrees as the first groups began their ascent from Logan Pass. The boardwalk section of the Hidden Lake Trail was designed to minimize human impact on the fragile alpine environment while providing safe passage through areas where grizzly bears were known to forage. The elevated wooden walkway stretched for approximately half a mile through meadows that in late May were just beginning to show the first hints of wildflower blooms. Rachel Turner stepped onto the boardwalk with the eager gait of someone experiencing true alpine wilderness for the first time. Her hiking boots, brand new REI purchases that she'd broken in during several weekend hikes around Missoula, made soft thumping sounds against the wooden planks. She paused frequently to take photographs with her phone, capturing not just the sweeping mountain vistas, but also the smaller details, the intricate patterns of morning frost on wild grasses, the way sunlight filtered through low-hanging clouds, the geometric precision of the boardwalk disappearing into the distance. Marcus walked a few steps behind Rachel, his professional camera gear creating a rhythmic clicking soundtrack as he documented their journey. Through his telephoto lens, he captured images of the surrounding peaks, Mount Reynolds to the north, Mount Clements to the east, and the imposing mass of the Continental Divide stretching endlessly in both directions. But it was the human elements that drew his artistic eye most strongly. Rachel's obvious wonder at her surroundings, the careful way Sarah scanned the terrain for wildlife signs, the methodical progression of other hiking groups spread out along the trail. Sarah Hoffman maintained her position slightly ahead of her companions, her trained eye constantly surveying the landscape for signs of wildlife activity. She noted several areas where the vegetation showed signs of disturbance, broken branches, trampled grasses, and what appeared to be claw marks on several aspen trees near the trailhead. These signs didn't alarm her. They were exactly what she'd come to document for her research. Grizzly bears used the Hidden Lake area as a corridor between feeding areas, and evidence of their presence was not only expected, but welcomed as confirmation that the ecosystem remained healthy and intact. The first section of the trail climbed steadily through subalpine meadows, where the previous year's wildflowers had left behind dried stalks and seed heads that crunched softly underfoot. The group made good time, covering the initial half-mile in approximately 20 minutes. As they gained elevation, the views opened up dramatically, revealing the full scope of the Continental Divide and the maze of valleys and peaks that comprise the heart of Glacier National Park. By 8 a.m., they had reached the section of trail where the boardwalk gave way to a more traditional dirt path. The temperature had climbed to 52 degrees, and several members of the group had removed their outer layers, stuffing jackets into backpacks as the climbing warmed their bodies. The trail here wound through stands of whitebark pine and subalpine fir, creating a more enclosed feeling after the open meadows of the boardwalk section. It was in this more heavily forested area that Sarah first noticed the tracks. The impressions in the soft earth beside the trail were unmistakably those of a large grizzly bear, the distinctive claw marks extending well beyond the toe prints, the massive size indicating an adult animal, possibly male. Sarah knelt beside the clearest print, using a small ruler from her research kit to measure the dimensions. The front paw print measured just over 10 inches in length, suggesting a bear weighing between 400 and 500 pounds. Rachel and Marcus gathered around Sarah as she explained what the tracks revealed. The impressions were relatively fresh, probably made within the last 24 to 48 hours based on their clarity and the fact that the previous night's light rain hadn't completely obscured them. The bear had been traveling in the same direction they were hiking, toward Hidden Lake, which wasn't unusual given that the lake and surrounding area provided rich feeding opportunities for grizzlies during late spring and early summer. As Sarah photographed and measured the tracks, she explained to her companions that finding bear sign on the Hidden Lake Trail was not cause for alarm, but rather reason for increased awareness and proper precautionary behavior. Grizzly bears typically avoided human contact when possible, and the steady stream of hikers on this popular trail usually provided enough noise and activity to keep bears at a comfortable distance. However, she emphasized the importance of staying together as a group, making noise while hiking, and being prepared to use bear spray if an encounter occurred. The Kawashima family had caught up to Rachel's group while Sarah was examining the tracks, and Hiroshi expressed fascination with Sarah's explanation of bear behavior and tracking techniques. Through a combination of English and gestures, he communicated his excitement at finding such clear evidence of wildlife presence. His son Taro filmed Sarah's impromptu educational presentation, recognizing that this authentic moment of field research would make excellent content for his documentation of their American adventure. By 8:30 a.m., the combined groups had resumed their ascent toward Hidden Lake. The trail continued to climb steadily, gaining approximately 200 feet of elevation over the next half-mile. The forest began to thin as they approached treeline, with the dense stands of subalpine fir giving way to more widely spaced whitebark pine and increasing areas of open meadow. The weather remained ideal for hiking, with temperatures reaching the mid-50s and only light clouds dotting an otherwise clear blue sky. A gentle breeze from the west carried the scent of pine and the distant sound of snowmelt cascading down from the higher peaks. Rachel found herself stopping frequently to simply absorb the sensory richness of the high alpine environment, the crispness of the air, the intensity of the sunlight at elevation, the profound silence broken only by their footsteps and occasional conversation. As they approached the 1-mile mark of their hike, the trail crossed several small seasonal streams, swollen with snowmelt from the surrounding peaks. The wooden bridges spanning these waterways provided convenient rest stops where hikers could pause to hydrate and enjoy snacks while taking in the increasingly spectacular mountain views. It was at one of these bridges that Dr. Whitmore caught up with their group, having maintained a steady solo pace behind them since leaving the trailhead. James Whitmore represented the type of visitor that Glacier attracted in significant numbers: successful professionals seeking renewal and perspective in wilderness settings. At 45, he was going through the most challenging period of his adult life. His 20-year marriage had ended 6 months earlier when his wife had finally confronted him about the distance that had grown between them over years of 18-hour workdays and weekend surgeries. The divorce proceedings had been acrimonious, complicated by custody disputes over their teenage daughter and disagreements about asset division that had dragged on for months. This solo hiking trip represented James's attempt to reconnect with himself outside the pressures of his surgical practice and the emotional turmoil of his personal life. He had been an avid outdoorsman during his college years and medical school, but the demands of building his orthopedic surgery practice had gradually consumed all his time and energy. Now, facing the reality of starting over at middle age, he was trying to rediscover the sense of peace and perspective that had once drawn him to wilderness areas. As the groups merged at the bridge crossing, conversations naturally developed about their various motivations for visiting Glacier. Rachel spoke enthusiastically about her environmental science studies, and her dreams of working in conservation biology after graduation. Marcus shared his artistic vision of using photography to document climate change impacts on high-elevation ecosystems. Sarah discussed her research on human-bear coexistence and the challenges of managing wildlife populations in increasingly popular national parks. The Andersons contributed their wealth of experience about Glacier's ecology and history, sharing stories of changes they'd observed over their 15 years of visits. Robert Anderson spoke knowledgeably about the park's glacial retreat, explaining how the Hidden Lake area had been dramatically altered by climate change over the past several decades. Margaret Anderson pointed out various plant species and explained their adaptations to the harsh alpine environment. By 9 a.m., the expanded group had reached approximately the 1.5-mile point of the trail, where the path began its final climb toward the Hidden Lake overlook. The terrain here was more exposed, with sweeping views back down the valley toward Logan Pass and the visitor center. The morning sun had climbed higher, casting dramatic shadows across the mountainous landscape and warming the air to approximately 58 degrees. It was in this section that Elena Rodriguez, the park ranger, caught up with their group. Elena had started her hike earlier, but had been delayed by several wildlife sightings that required documentation for the park's ongoing research programs. She carried a radio that crackled occasionally with communications between park personnel, and her presence added an official dimension to what had become an impromptu hiking community. Elena's arrival prompted questions about recent bear activity in the area. She confirmed that several grizzly bears were known to frequent the Hidden Lake corridor, including at least 2 adult females with cubs and what appeared to be a large male that had been observed multiple times over the past week. The male bear had been tagged as G417 during a research capture several years earlier, and GPS collar data indicated that he spent significant time in the Hidden Lake drainage during late spring and early summer. The information about G417 was both reassuring and concerning. Reassuring because the bear's familiarity with human presence suggested he had learned to coexist with park visitors without aggressive incidents. Concerning because large male grizzlies could be unpredictable, especially during the spring mating season when testosterone levels and territorial behaviors were at their peak. Elena emphasized the importance of following standard bear safety protocols, while also noting that encounters on the Hidden Lake Trail were rare due to the high level of human traffic. As the group prepared to continue their ascent to Hidden Lake, Elena used her radio to check in with the Logan Pass Visitor Center, reporting normal conditions and steady hiker traffic on the trail. Her conversation with dispatch revealed that several other ranger patrols were active throughout the park that morning, conducting routine wildlife monitoring and visitor contact activities. The radio chatter provided a comforting reminder of the professional oversight that helped ensure visitor safety in Glacier's wilderness areas. The final half-mile to Hidden Lake overlook represented the steepest section of the trail, climbing approximately 150 feet through increasingly sparse vegetation as the path approached the alpine zone proper. The hikers spread out naturally as the grade increased, with the younger and more athletic members of the group, including Rachel and Taro Kawashima, pulling ahead of the older participants. Rachel's excitement had continued to build throughout the morning as the mountain scenery became increasingly spectacular. She had grown up in Great Falls, Montana, but had never experienced the high alpine environment of Glacier National Park. Every turn in the trail revealed new vistas that left her practically breathless with wonder. Her phone's memory was filling rapidly with photographs as she attempted to capture not just the sweeping mountain panoramas, but also the intimate details of alpine flora and the play of morning light across the landscape. Marcus had switched to his wide-angle lens to capture the expansive views that were opening up as they gained elevation. Through his viewfinder, he composed shots that included both the human elements of their hiking group and the overwhelming scale of the wilderness surrounding them. His artistic eye was particularly drawn to the contrasts inherent in the scene, the geometric precision of the wooden boardwalk against the organic chaos of the mountainous terrain, the bright colors of modern hiking gear against the muted tones of the natural landscape, the small scale of human figures dwarfed by the immensity of the continental divide. As they approached the final switchbacks leading to the Hidden Lake overlook, Sarah continued her ongoing survey of wildlife signs and habitat conditions. She noted several areas where grizzly bears had been digging for roots and bulbs, creating small excavations in the alpine turf that would likely regenerate quickly once the growing season progressed. The abundance of bear sign was actually encouraging from a conservation perspective, indicating that the Hidden Lake area continued to provide high-quality habitat for one of North America's most charismatic megafauna species. At approximately 9:30 a.m., Rachel Turner reached the wooden observation platform that marked the official end of the Hidden Lake Trail. The overlook provided panoramic views of Hidden Lake itself, a pristine alpine tarn nestled in a cirque carved by glacial action over millennia. The lake's surface reflected the surrounding peaks like a mirror, creating a scene of almost surreal beauty that justified Glacier National Park's reputation as one of America's premier wilderness destinations. The observation platform was designed to accommodate multiple groups of visitors while minimizing impact on the fragile alpine environment. Wooden benches and interpretive signs provided information about the area's geology, ecology, and wildlife, while encouraging visitors to observe and photograph from designated areas. The platform was elevated approximately 6 feet above the surrounding terrain, providing clear sight lines across the lake and the surrounding mountains while keeping visitors safely separated from sensitive habitat areas. Rachel immediately claimed a spot at the platform's eastern edge, where the morning light provided optimal conditions for photography. She spent several minutes capturing images of Hidden Lake and the surrounding peaks, using her phone's panoramic function to document the full scope of the vista. Her enthusiasm was infectious, drawing smiles and shared excitement from other members of their hiking group as they joined her at the overlook. Marcus set up his professional camera equipment for a more systematic documentation of the scene. Using a tripod to ensure sharp images, he captured a series of photographs that would later become part of his ongoing project documenting climate change impacts in high-elevation ecosystems. The Hidden Lake area showed clear evidence of glacial retreat, with former ice fields now reduced to small patches of permanent snowfield. His photographs would contribute to a visual record of these changes that scientists could use to track environmental transformation over time. The Kawashima family spread out along the platform's western edge, where Hiroshi used a powerful telephoto lens to scan for wildlife, while Keiko sketched wildflower species in her notebook. Taro continued his video documentation of their American adventure, interviewing other hikers about their experiences and motivations for visiting Glacier. His footage would eventually become part of a longer documentary about their family's journey through America's national parks. Dr. Whitmore found a quiet spot at the platform's northern corner, where he could contemplate the scene in relative solitude. The overwhelming beauty and serenity of Hidden Lake provided exactly the kind of perspective and renewal he had been seeking. For the first time in months, he felt a sense of peace that had been absent during the turmoil of his divorce proceedings and the stress of his surgical practice. The simple act of achieving this beautiful destination through his own physical effort had restored a sense of personal accomplishment that had been missing from his life. By 10 a.m., additional hiking groups had reached the Hidden Lake overlook, creating a small community of outdoor enthusiasts sharing this spectacular mountain environment. The observation platform accommodated approximately 20 people comfortably, and the various groups naturally clustered around different vantage points while maintaining the respectful spacing that experienced hikers understood as wilderness etiquette. Elena Rodriguez used the opportunity provided by the gathering to conduct an informal educational program about grizzly bear ecology and safety practices. Her presentation was casual but informative, drawing on her 8 years of experience working in bear country and her extensive training in wildlife management. She explained how grizzly bears use the Hidden Lake area as a travel corridor between seasonal feeding areas, emphasizing that human visitors were essentially guests in habitat that belonged to these magnificent predators. The rangers' discussion of bear behavior patterns was particularly relevant, given the fresh tracks they had observed earlier in the morning. Elena explained that G417, the large male grizzly known to frequent the area, was likely moving between the higher elevation feeding areas around Hidden Lake and the lower elevation habitat along McDonald Creek. This movement pattern was typical for adult male grizzlies during late spring, when they sought diverse food sources while also patrolling territory during the breeding season. Elena's educational presentation included practical demonstrations of proper bear spray deployment techniques and group hiking protocols designed to minimize the likelihood of surprise encounters. She emphasized that the vast majority of human-bear interactions in Glacier ended without incident when visitors followed established safety guidelines. However, she also stressed that wilderness areas inherently involved some level of risk, and that visitors needed to take personal responsibility for their safety while enjoying the park's natural wonders. As the morning progressed toward 10:30, the various hiking groups began to disperse from the Hidden Lake overlook. Some visitors were content with reaching the official destination and began their return journey to Logan Pass. Others, including several of the younger and more adventurous hikers, expressed interest in exploring the area around Hidden Lake itself, though Elena cautioned that leaving the designated trail system required additional permits and involved significantly greater risks. Rachel Turner found herself torn between the desire to explore further and recognition that their planned itinerary called for returning to the trailhead by early afternoon. She had hoped to spend more time at Hidden Lake, perhaps finding a quiet spot where she could sit beside the water and fully absorb the experience of being in this pristine, alpine environment. However, Marcus was anxious about lighting conditions for his photography, preferring to use the morning hours when shadows and contrast were optimal for mountain scenery. Sarah Hoffman was documenting the various bear signs she had observed throughout their hike, using GPS coordinates to map locations where tracks, scat, and feeding evidence had been found. Her research focused on understanding how grizzly bears adapted their behavior patterns in response to human recreational use, and the Hidden Lake Trail provided an ideal study site where significant wildlife activity overlapped with heavy visitor traffic. At approximately 10:45 a.m., Rachel's group began their descent from the Hidden Lake overlook, joining the flow of hikers returning toward Logan Pass. The downhill journey would be faster than their ascent, but Eleanor had emphasized the importance of maintaining awareness and continuing to follow bear safety protocols throughout the return trip. Bears could appear anywhere along the trail corridor, and the false sense of security that sometimes developed during the return leg of a hike could lead to careless behavior and potentially dangerous situations. The first section of their descent retraced their route through the alpine zone above treeline, where expansive views continued to provide spectacular photographic opportunities. Rachel found that the changing angle of morning sunlight created entirely different visual compositions compared to their earlier ascent, and she continued to document their journey with enthusiasm. Her phone's battery was beginning to run low from the constant photography, but she was reluctant to miss any potential shots of this once-in-a-lifetime experience. Marcus had switched back to his telephoto lens to capture detailed images of the surrounding peaks and to scan for wildlife that might be visible from their elevated position. Through his viewfinder, he observed several mountain goats on the distant slopes of Mount Reynolds, their white coats clearly visible against the dark rock faces, even at considerable distance. These images would add another dimension to his documentation of Glacier's ecosystem, illustrating the diversity of wildlife that called these mountains home. As they descended through the transition zone between alpine tundra and subalpine forest, Sarah continued to point out signs of grizzly bear activity. The abundance of evidence along this section of trail confirmed that bears used the Hidden Lake corridor regularly, following established travel routes between different habitat areas. She noted several trees that showed fresh claw marks, indicating that bears had been marking territory or searching for insects in the bark within the past few days. The trail's descent through the forested section required more careful attention to footing, especially as morning warming began to create muddy conditions in areas where snowmelt crossed the path. The wooden bridges spanning seasonal streams had developed a thin layer of moisture that made them slightly slippery, requiring hikers to proceed with appropriate caution. These conditions were typical for late May in Glacier, when rapid temperature changes between night and day created constantly evolving trail conditions. By 11:15 a.m., Rachel's group had reached the section of trail where they had initially observed the fresh grizzly bear tracks during their morning ascent. Sarah took the opportunity to examine the area more thoroughly, looking for additional signs that might provide insights into the bear's recent behavior patterns. She discovered several daybeds in the surrounding vegetation, indicating that G417, or another large bear, had been resting in the area within the past few days. The presence of multiple daybeds suggested that the bear was comfortable in this location and was using it as a temporary base while feeding in the surrounding area. Sarah explained to her companions that this behavior was typical for adult male grizzlies during late spring, when abundant food sources allowed them to remain in relatively small areas for extended periods. However, she also noted that day beds in close proximity to hiking trails required careful monitoring by park personnel to ensure visitor safety. Elena Rodriguez had been monitoring radio communications throughout their descent, staying in contact with other park personnel about trail conditions and wildlife activity. Her radio crackled with routine reports from various locations throughout Glacier, creating a reassuring background soundtrack of professional oversight and communication. The Ranger Network's constant vigilance helped ensure that developing situations could be addressed quickly and that visitor safety remained the top priority. As they approached the junction where the dirt trail transitioned back to the elevated boardwalk system, several members of their group commented on how different the landscape appeared from this new perspective. The changing angle of sunlight and their reverse direction of travel created the impression of experiencing an entirely different environment, even though they were retracing their exact route from the morning ascent. Rachel Turner paused at the beginning of the boardwalk to take a final series of photographs looking back toward Hidden Lake and the peaks they had just left behind. The morning's adventure had exceeded all her expectations, providing both the spectacular mountain scenery she had hoped to experience and the educational insights into grizzly bear ecology that connected directly to her academic studies. She felt a profound sense of accomplishment at having successfully completed this challenging hike, while also gaining first-hand knowledge about wildlife conservation issues. The elevated boardwalk section of their return journey provided a different perspective on the alpine meadows they had traversed that morning. The wooden walkway elevated them above the fragile vegetation, offering clear views across the expansive grasslands toward the Continental Divide. From this vantage point, they could observe the subtle variations in plant communities that reflected differences in elevation, moisture, and exposure to wind and sun. Marcus continued his systematic documentation of the return journey, capturing images that showed the contrast between the constructed environment of the boardwalk and the wild landscape surrounding it. His photographs would illustrate the careful balance that national park managers struck between providing visitor access and protecting sensitive ecosystems. The elevated walkway represented thoughtful design that allowed thousands of visitors to experience pristine wilderness without causing irreversible environmental damage. At 11:45 a.m., as they walked along a straight section of boardwalk approximately half a mile from Logan Pass, Sarah Hoffman noticed movement in the meadow vegetation approximately 100 yards to their right. Her trained eye immediately recognized the distinctive rolling gait and massive build that could only belong to a large grizzly bear. The animal was moving parallel to the boardwalk, traveling in the same direction as their hiking group, but separated by a comfortable distance of open meadow. Sarah immediately signaled for their group to stop and quietly pointed out the bear's location to her companions. The animal appeared to be an adult male, consistent with the size suggested by the tracks they had observed earlier in the morning. G417 was likely the same bear whose signs they had been following throughout their hike, now visible in person as he went about his normal foraging behavior in the alpine meadows around Hidden Lake. The grizzly bear was magnificent to observe from their safe position on the elevated boardwalk. Standing approximately 3.5 feet tall at the shoulder while on all fours, the bear would likely weigh between 400 and 500 pounds, representing the apex of predatory evolution in North American ecosystems. His coat showed the classic grizzled brown coloration that gave grizzly bears their common name, with lighter tips on the guard hairs, creating a frosted appearance that seemed to shimmer in the morning sunlight. Rachel Turner was simultaneously thrilled and terrified by her first wild grizzly bear sighting. The animal represented everything she had studied theoretically in her environmental science courses, but seeing such a powerful predator in its natural habitat was overwhelmingly different from textbook descriptions and classroom discussions. Her hands shook slightly as she attempted to photograph the bear with her phone, though the distance made it difficult to capture clear images without a telephoto lens. Marcus immediately switched to his longest telephoto lens and began photographing the grizzly bear's behavior with professional, systematic approach. His images would document the bear's foraging patterns, body language, and interaction with the alpine environment, contributing valuable data to ongoing research programs. However, he was careful to avoid using flash or making sudden movements that might attract the animal's attention or alter its natural behavior patterns. The bear appeared completely unaware of the human observers on the boardwalk, focusing intently on foraging activities in the meadow vegetation. Sarah explained in whispered tones that the animal was likely searching for roots, bulbs, and early-season grasses that provided essential nutrition after the long winter hibernation period. This feeding behavior was typical for grizzly bears during late spring, when plant-based foods comprised the majority of their diet. Elena Rodriguez quietly used her radio to report the grizzly bear sighting to Park Dispatch, providing GPS coordinates and a description of the animal's behavior and direction of travel. This information would be shared with other rangers and trail crews working in the area, ensuring that appropriate precautions could be taken if the bear's movements brought it closer to visitor facilities or high-traffic areas. The Kawashima family was particularly excited by the bear sighting, as observing grizzly bears in their natural habitat had been one of their primary goals for visiting Glacier National Park. Hiroshi managed to capture several photographs and video footage despite the significant distance, while Keiko made detailed notes about the bear's appearance and behavior for her students back in Japan. Taro filmed the encounter while providing whispered commentary for his YouTube documentation of their American adventure. Dr. Whitmore found the bear sighting to be profoundly moving in ways he hadn't anticipated. The raw power and wild dignity of the grizzly bear represented everything that was missing from his controlled, sterile professional environment as a surgeon. Watching this magnificent predator going about its daily survival activities in one of the last intact wilderness areas in the lower 48 states provided a perspective on what truly mattered in life that no amount of financial success or professional achievement could match. For approximately 10 minutes, the various hiking groups that had gathered on the boardwalk observed the grizzly bear's foraging behavior from their safe, elevated position. The animal moved with surprising grace for such a massive creature, using its powerful claws to dig in the meadow soil and its sensitive nose to locate food sources hidden beneath the surface vegetation. The bear's behavior provided a perfect illustration of the ecological principles that Sarah had been studying in her graduate research. As the bear continued foraging, gradually moving further from the boardwalk toward the base of the surrounding mountains, Elena Rodriguez made the decision to continue their descent toward Logan Pass. The animal's behavior and body language indicated no awareness of or interest in the human observers, suggesting that it would continue its normal activities without posing any risk to trail users. However, she emphasized the importance of maintaining group cohesion and continuing to follow standard bear safety protocols for the remainder of their hike. The excitement generated by their grizzly bear sighting energized the various hiking groups as they resumed their descent along the boardwalk. Conversations buzzed with shared amazement at having witnessed one of North America's most iconic predators in its natural habitat. The experience had transformed what was already a spectacular mountain hike into something truly memorable, providing the kind of wildlife encounter that visitors to national parks hope for but rarely achieve. Rachel Turner felt as though she had just experienced a defining moment in her young life. Seeing a wild grizzly bear had connected her academic studies to visceral reality in ways that no classroom lecture or textbook could achieve. The power and presence of the animal had filled her with a deep appreciation for the importance of wilderness preservation and wildlife conservation that would influence her career choices and personal values for years to come. As they continued along the boardwalk, Marcus reviewed the photographs he had captured of the grizzly bear encounter. Even through his telephoto lens, the images captured only a fraction of the emotional impact of observing the animal in person. However, the photographs would serve as valuable documentation of grizzly bear behavior and habitat use that could contribute to ongoing conservation research and public education efforts. By 12:15 p.m., the various hiking groups had reached the final section of boardwalk before the transition to the parking area at Logan Pass. The morning's adventure was drawing to a close, but the excitement generated by their grizzly bear sighting continued to fuel animated conversations about wildlife conservation, wilderness preservation, and the importance of maintaining healthy ecosystems for future generations. Sarah Hoffman was already planning how to incorporate the morning's observations into her doctoral research on human-bear coexistence. The successful wildlife viewing experience they had just shared illustrated the potential for positive interactions between park visitors and grizzly bears when appropriate safety protocols were followed and visitors were properly educated about bear behavior and ecology. The temperature had climbed to the mid-60s by early afternoon, creating perfect conditions for outdoor recreation. The parking area at Logan Pass was considerably busier than it had been during their early morning departure, with dozens of vehicles and hundreds of visitors preparing for various hiking and sightseeing activities throughout the area. The steady stream of human activity provided a sharp contrast to the wild serenity they had experienced at Hidden Lake. As Rachel's group prepared to conclude their hiking adventure, They exchanged contact information and made tentative plans to explore other areas of Glacier National Park together during the remainder of their respective visits. The shared experience of their successful wildlife encounter had created bonds that extended beyond their temporary association as hiking companions, illustrating the social connections that often developed among visitors to national parks. Elena Rodriguez completed her official documentation of the day's patrol activities, including detailed reports about trail conditions, visitor contacts, and wildlife observations. Her paperwork would become part of the permanent record that park managers used to track patterns of recreational use and animal behavior, contributing to the long-term database that informed management decisions about visitor access and wildlife protection. At 12:30 p.m., as most of the hiking groups were preparing to depart Logan Pass for other destinations, Sarah Hoffman noticed that the grizzly bear they had observed earlier was moving back toward the Hidden Lake Trail corridor. The animal appeared to be following a well-established travel route that brought it closer to the boardwalk system, though still at a safe distance that posed no immediate threat to trail users. Elena Rodriguez received a radio call from Park Dispatch reporting that several other groups of hikers were currently on the Hidden Lake Trail, including families with small children who had started their ascent within the past hour. The ranger made the decision to hike back up the trail to provide additional safety monitoring and to ensure that the approaching bear's presence didn't create any dangerous situations with less experienced visitors. Sarah volunteered to accompany Elena on this additional safety patrol, recognizing that her expertise in grizzly bear behavior could be valuable in assessing the situation and providing guidance to other trail users. Marcus also elected to return with them, motivated by the opportunity to document human-bear coexistence management in action and to capture additional photographs of G417 if the opportunity arose. Rachel Turner faced a difficult decision about whether to join the return trip up the Hidden Lake Trail. Her original plans called for visiting other areas of the park during the afternoon, and she was concerned about having sufficient time for all the activities she had hoped to experience during her weekend visit to Glacier. However, the opportunity to observe professional wildlife management in action and potentially witness additional grizzly bear behavior was extraordinarily appealing to someone studying environmental science. After brief consultation with her companions and checking her schedule, Rachel decided to accompany Elena's safety patrol back up the Hidden Lake Trail. The additional hiking would exceed her original plans for physical activity, but the educational and experiential opportunities were too valuable to miss. She quickly sent text messages to friends in Missoula, updating them about her extended adventure and her excitement about the grizzly bear sighting. At 12:45 p.m., the smaller group consisting of Elena Rodriguez, Sarah Hoffman, Marcus Chen, and Rachel Turner began their second ascent of the Hidden Lake Trail. Their pace was considerably faster than the leisurely morning hike, as Elena was motivated by the need to reach potentially vulnerable visitors before any problematic interactions developed with the approaching grizzly bear. The early afternoon lighting created entirely different photographic conditions compared to their morning ascent, and Marcus found himself capturing images that emphasized different aspects of the landscape. The higher sun angle reduced the dramatic shadows that had characterized his morning shots, but it also revealed details in the mountain terrain that had been obscured earlier in the day. As they climbed rapidly through the forested sections of the trail, Elena maintained radio contact with Park Dispatch and other ranger personnel, coordinating their response to ensure that adequate safety coverage was maintained throughout the Hidden Lake area. The professional coordination involved in managing potential human-wildlife conflicts illustrated the complex logistical challenges that national park personnel faced in balancing visitor access with conservation priorities. Sarah continued to observe and document additional bear signs that had been missed during their earlier passage, including several fresh tracks that appeared to have been made within the past few hours. The abundance of recent bear activity confirmed that G417 was actively using the trail corridor, and that continued monitoring would be necessary to ensure visitor safety. By 1:15 p.m., their rapid ascent had brought them back to the area where they had initially observed the grizzly bear from the boardwalk. Elena's radio crackled with a report from another ranger who had visual contact with the bear from a different vantage point, confirming that the animal was continuing to move toward the trail corridor while showing no signs of agitation or aggressive behavior. The ranger's professional assessment was that G417 was simply following his normal travel patterns between feeding areas, unaware of and unconcerned about human presence in the area. However, the bear's size and the unpredictable nature of wildlife required constant vigilance and preparation for rapid response if circumstances changed. Elena's experience had taught her that situations involving large predators could evolve quickly, and that proactive safety measures were always preferable to reactive emergency responses. As they approached the boardwalk section where they had made their earlier wildlife observation, Elena used binoculars to scan the surrounding meadows for signs of both the grizzly bear and other trail users who might be in the area. The open terrain provided excellent visibility across the alpine environment, allowing for effective monitoring of both wildlife movements and visitor activities. At 1:25 p.m., Eleanor spotted a family group with 3 small children walking along the boardwalk approximately half a mile ahead of their position. The family appeared to be moving slowly and stopping frequently for photographs, typical behavior for visitors experiencing the Hidden Lake Trail for the first time. However, their leisurely pace and apparent lack of awareness about potential wildlife encounters concerned Elena, especially given the approaching grizzly bear's trajectory. Using her radio, Elena coordinated with Park Dispatch to have additional ranger personnel positioned at strategic locations along the trail system, creating a safety network that could respond quickly if the grizzly bear's behavior changed, or if direct intervention became necessary to protect visitors. The professional response illustrated the comprehensive safety protocols that Glacier National Park had developed through decades of experience managing human-wildlife interactions. Rachel Turner was fascinated by the real-time wildlife management strategies she was witnessing. Her environmental science coursework had covered theoretical approaches to human-wildlife conflict resolution, but observing professional implementation of these strategies provided invaluable practical insights that would enhance her academic understanding and career preparation. She took careful notes about the coordination between different ranger teams and the decision-making processes involved in visitor safety management. As they continued their approach along the boardwalk, Marcus documented the afternoon landscape with his camera while maintaining awareness of the developing wildlife situation. His photographs captured the contrast between the serene beauty of the alpine environment and the underlying tension created by the presence of a large predator in an area used by hundreds of recreational visitors daily. Sarah Hoffman used the opportunity to observe how her theoretical research on human-bear coexistence translated into practical management situations. The professional response she was witnessing illustrated the complex balance that park personnel maintained between allowing natural wildlife behaviors and ensuring visitor safety. Her doctoral research would benefit significantly from these real-world observations of conflict resolution strategies. At 1:35 p.m., Elena made visual contact with the family group ahead of them and increased their pace to close the distance before any potential wildlife encounter could occur. The family consisted of parents in their 30s with children who appeared to range in age from approximately 6 to 12 years old. They were clearly enjoying their hiking experience, but showed no indication of awareness about proper bear safety protocols or the potential for wildlife encounters. Elena's approach to the family was professional but casual, designed to provide safety information without creating unnecessary alarm or panic. She identified herself as a park ranger, conducting routine trail patrols, and began a conversation about their hiking experience while simultaneously assessing their knowledge of bear safety procedures and their preparedness for potential wildlife encounters. The family, the Hendersons from Minneapolis, had limited experience with wilderness hiking and had chosen the Hidden Lake Trail based on its reputation as a family-friendly destination suitable for children. Their preparation for the hike had focused primarily on physical conditioning and appropriate clothing, with minimal consideration of wildlife safety protocols beyond reading the basic warnings posted at the trailhead. Elena used the opportunity to provide impromptu education about grizzly bear behavior and safety procedures, demonstrating proper bear spray deployment techniques and explaining the rationale behind group hiking protocols. Her presentation was informative but not alarmist, designed to enhance the family's wilderness skills while maintaining their enjoyment of the hiking experience. As Elena conducted her educational interaction with the Henderson family, Sarah monitored the surrounding area for signs of the approaching grizzly bear. Her trained eye continued to scan the meadows and forest edges for movement or other indicators of wildlife presence, maintaining the vigilance that her research experience had taught her was essential when working in bear habitat. At 1:42 p.m., Marcus noticed movement in the vegetation approximately 200 yards from their position on the boardwalk. The distinctive shape and gait immediately identified the approaching animal as the same large grizzly bear they had observed earlier in the day. G417 appeared to be following a well-used game trail that would bring him within approximately 50 yards of the boardwalk system. Elena immediately assessed the situation and made the decision to move the Henderson family to a position further along the boardwalk, where they would maintain greater distance from the bear's apparent route. Her calm but authoritative instructions demonstrated the professional competence that came from years of experience managing similar situations in Glacier's wilderness environment. The grizzly bear's behavior continued to appear normal and non-threatening as he moved through his familiar territory. The animal showed no signs of awareness or interest in the human observers, focusing intently on foraging activities and scent-marking behaviors typical of adult male bears during the breeding season. His massive size and confident demeanor illustrated why grizzly bears commanded such respect in wilderness environments. Rachel Turner found herself simultaneously terrified and fascinated by this second encounter with G417. The bear's proximity to their position on the boardwalk was both thrilling and intimidating, providing an unforgettable wildlife experience while also reinforcing the very real risks involved in sharing habitat with large predators. Her heart rate increased dramatically as she observed the bear's powerful movements and realized the relatively small distance that separated them from one of North America's apex predators. Elena maintained constant radio communication with other park personnel, providing real-time updates about the grizzly bear's location and behavior while coordinating appropriate response strategies. Her professional assessment was that the situation remained manageable as long as all human participants followed established safety protocols and avoided any actions that might alter the bear's natural behavior patterns. The Henderson family responded well to Elena's guidance, demonstrating appropriate caution while continuing to appreciate the remarkable wildlife viewing opportunity they were experiencing. Their children were particularly excited by the grizzly bear sighting, though they remained close to their parents and followed instructions about remaining quiet and avoiding sudden movements. As the bear continued his progress through the meadow, gradually moving away from the boardwalk toward the base of the surrounding mountains, Elena assessed that the immediate risk to trail users had diminished. However, she maintained her vigilant monitoring of both wildlife and visitor activities, recognizing that situations in wilderness environments could change rapidly and required constant professional attention. By 1:55 p.m., G417 had moved sufficiently far from the boardwalk system that Elena determined it was safe for hiking groups to resume normal trail activities. The grizzly bear appeared to be following established travel routes toward higher elevation habitat, behavior that was consistent with normal seasonal patterns and posed minimal ongoing risk to visitors using designated trail systems. Elena used her radio to update park dispatch about the resolved wildlife situation, while also providing detailed documentation for the incident reports that would become part of Glacier's permanent management records. Her professional handling of the encounter illustrated the expertise that national park personnel brought to complex wildlife management challenges. The Henderson family expressed profound gratitude for Elena's educational assistance and professional guidance during their grizzly bear encounter. The experience had provided them with invaluable wilderness education while also creating memories that would last a lifetime. Their children were particularly excited about sharing their bear sighting with friends and classmates back in Minneapolis. Sarah Hoffman took advantage of the calmer situation to continue her documentation of grizzly bear habitat use and behavior patterns. The afternoon's observations had provided valuable data for her doctoral research, while also illustrating the practical applications of human-bear coexistence management strategies in high-traffic recreational areas. Rachel Turner felt that the day's experiences had fundamentally changed her understanding of wilderness conservation and wildlife management. Observing professional rangers handling real-world human-wildlife conflicts had provided insights that would influence her career goals and academic focus for years to come. The combination of spectacular natural beauty and authentic wildlife encounters had created exactly the kind of transformative experience she had hoped to gain from visiting Glacier National Park. As the various groups prepared to continue their afternoon activities, Marcus reviewed the extensive photographic documentation he had captured throughout the day. His images told a complete story of successful human-bear coexistence, illustrating both the challenges and rewards of maintaining access to wilderness areas where large predators continued to thrive in their natural habitats. At 2:10 p.m., Elena made the decision to escort the Henderson family back toward Logan Pass, ensuring their safe completion of the Hidden Lake Trail while also maintaining professional supervision of the area where G417 had been observed. Her continued presence would provide reassurance for other trail users while also gathering additional data about bear movement patterns and habitat use. Sarah, Marcus, and Rachel elected to remain in the area for additional wildlife observation and research documentation, recognizing that the afternoon might provide further opportunities to observe grizzly bear behavior and habitat interactions. Their extended presence would also contribute to the ongoing monitoring that Elena had established to ensure continued visitor safety. The decision to extend their time on the Hidden Lake Trail represented a commitment to both scientific observation and wilderness education that went beyond typical recreational hiking. Rachel felt particularly motivated by the opportunity to contribute to real conservation research while also gaining first-hand experience with the field methods she'd been studying in her academic coursework. As Elena and the Henderson family began their descent toward Logan Pass, the afternoon sunlight created dramatic lighting conditions across the alpine landscape. The changing shadows and warm light transformed the mountain scenery, providing entirely different photographic opportunities compared to the morning conditions that had characterized their earlier hike. At 2:25 p.m., as the reduced group settled into their extended wildlife observation session, Sarah noticed additional movement in the meadow areas where G417 had been foraging earlier. Her binoculars revealed what appeared to be a second, smaller bear, approximately half a mile from their position, moving along a parallel route through the alpine terrain. The second bear appeared to be an adult female, possibly accompanied by cubs that were not immediately visible from their observation point on the boardwalk. Sarah explained to her companions that female grizzlies with cubs represented a different category of wildlife encounter, typically requiring greater caution and distance due to maternal protective behaviors that could be triggered by perceived threats to offspring. Marcus immediately began photographing the second bear while maintaining the telephoto distance that ensured his presence wouldn't influence the animal's natural behavior. The opportunity to document multiple grizzly bears using the Hidden Lake corridor simultaneously would provide valuable data for ongoing research programs focused on population dynamics and habitat use patterns. Rachel found herself overwhelmed by the incredible wildlife viewing opportunities they were experiencing. Her weekend visit to Glacier had already exceeded all expectations, providing multiple grizzly bear encounters, professional wildlife management education, and spectacular mountain scenery that surpassed anything she had imagined possible. The experience was reinforcing her commitment to pursuing a career in conservation biology and environmental protection. As they continued their observation of the second grizzly bear, Sarah maintained careful documentation of the animal's behavior patterns and habitat use. Her research required detailed records of bear activities that could be analyzed later to understand seasonal movement patterns and feeding strategies. The afternoon's observations were contributing significant data to her doctoral dissertation research. The female grizzly bear moved with the cautious awareness typical of mothers protecting young offspring, frequently pausing to scan the surrounding area and test the wind for scent information. Her behavior suggested the presence of cubs, though the young animals remained hidden in the vegetation and were not visible from the boardwalk observation point. At 2:40 p.m., Rachel's phone suddenly began receiving a series of urgent text messages from friends in Missoula who had been following news reports about a developing situation at Glacier National Park. The messages contained fragmented information about a serious wildlife incident somewhere in the park, but the details were unclear and contradictory. Sarah borrowed Rachel's phone to check the news reports and discovered that a grizzly bear attack had occurred earlier that day on a trail system in a different area of Glacier National Park. The initial reports were incomplete and confusing, with conflicting information about the location, circumstances, and severity of the incident. However, the news had already begun to generate significant media attention and public concern. Elena Rodriguez's radio immediately crackled with urgent communications from Park Dispatch, requiring her immediate return to coordinate emergency response activities related to the bear attack incident. The professional urgency in the radio communications indicated that the situation was serious and required immediate mobilization of park resources and personnel. The developing emergency situation created a dilemma for Sarah, Marcus, and Rachel, who were currently in an area where grizzly bear activity was known to be occurring. Eleanor's departure would leave them without professional supervision in a location where wildlife encounters were possible, though their current position on the elevated boardwalk provided relative safety for continued observation activities. Elena made the difficult decision to order all recreational visitors to return immediately to Logan Pass, while park personnel addressed the emergency situation elsewhere in Glacier. Her authority as a federal law enforcement officer made this directive mandatory, despite the disappointment it created for visitors who were hoping to continue their wildlife observation activities. The group began their immediate descent toward Logan Pass, though the urgency of their departure was tempered by the need to maintain appropriate safety protocols in an area where grizzly bears were actively present. Elena emphasized that hasty movements or panic could create additional dangerous situations that would complicate emergency response efforts throughout the park. As they walked rapidly along the boardwalk toward the trailhead, Marcus captured photographs that documented the abrupt transition from peaceful wildlife observation to emergency evacuation procedures. His images illustrated the complex balance between recreational access and safety management that characterized wilderness areas where large predators remained active. Rachel Turner felt a profound sense of disappointment that their remarkable wildlife viewing experience was being cut short by circumstances beyond their control. However, she also recognized the seriousness of the emergency situation and the professional responsibilities that Elena faced as a federal law enforcement officer in a crisis situation. The news reports about the bear attack continued to evolve as additional information became available, though many details remained unclear or contradictory. Sarah's professional interest in bear behavior and management made her particularly concerned about the potential implications of a serious attack for grizzly bear conservation programs and public attitudes toward wilderness preservation. At 3 p.m., the group reached the parking area at Logan Pass, where Elena immediately departed to respond to the emergency situation, while Sarah, Marcus, and Rachel were left to process the dramatic conclusion to their day's adventure. The contrast between their successful wildlife encounters and the tragic circumstances developing elsewhere in the park created a complex emotional response that combined gratitude for their positive experiences with concern for the unknown victims of the attack. Rachel's phone continued to receive messages from friends and family members who had learned about the bear attack through news reports and social media. The geographic details available in early news reports were vague enough that people were concerned about her safety, even though she had been in a completely different area of the vast national park. Marcus began the process of reviewing and organizing the extensive photographic documentation he had captured throughout their day on the Hidden Lake Trail. His images told a story of successful human-wildlife coexistence that contrasted sharply with the tragic events that were apparently unfolding elsewhere in Glacier. The juxtaposition highlighted both the rewards and risks inherent in wilderness recreation. Sarah used her professional contacts to gather additional information about the bear attack incident, recognizing that the circumstances and aftermath of such events had significant implications for her research on human-bear interactions. Her expertise in grizzly bear behavior would likely be valuable in understanding and responding to whatever had occurred. As they prepared to leave Logan Pass, the three companions exchanged contact information and made tentative plans to remain in touch as the situation developed. Their shared experience had created bonds that extended beyond their temporary association as hiking partners, and they were committed to supporting each other through the complex emotions generated by their day's adventures. The drive away from Logan Pass provided opportunities for reflection on the day's extraordinary experiences. Though the knowledge of a serious bear attack elsewhere in the park cast a shadow over what had otherwise been a perfect wilderness adventure. Rachel felt torn between gratitude for her incredible wildlife encounters and guilt about celebrating positive experiences while others had apparently suffered tragic circumstances. The developing news coverage of the bear attack began to include more specific details about the location and circumstances of the incident, though many questions remained unanswered. Initial reports suggested that the attack had occurred on a popular hiking trail during daylight hours, circumstances that made the incident particularly concerning for park management and the outdoor recreation community. As evening approached, Rachel Turner returned to her accommodations in West Glacier with her mind reeling from the day's experiences. The combination of spectacular mountain scenery, multiple grizzly bear encounters, professional wildlife education, and the tragic news of an attack elsewhere in the park had created an emotional intensity that would require significant time to process and understand. Her phone continued to receive calls and messages from concerned friends and family members as news reports about the bear attack spread through social media and national news outlets. The incident was clearly developing into a major story that would likely influence public perceptions about grizzly bear conservation and wilderness recreation for years to come. Sarah Hoffman spent the evening researching available information about the bear attack while also organizing the data she had collected during their day of wildlife observation. Her professional expertise would likely be called upon to help understand the circumstances of the attack and to contribute to the management response that would inevitably follow such a serious incident. Marcus Chen processed his photographic documentation from the Hidden Lake Trail, creating a visual record of their successful wildlife encounters that stood in stark contrast to the tragic events that had apparently occurred elsewhere in Glacier. His images captured the beauty and wonder of human-bear coexistence, while also serving as a reminder of the inherent risks involved in wilderness recreation. The three companions maintained contact throughout the evening as additional details about the bear attack became available through news reports and official park communications. The incident had apparently involved a young hiker who had become separated from her group during what was supposed to be a routine day hike on one of Glacier's most popular trails. Initial reports suggested that the attack had been witnessed by multiple people, creating a traumatic experience for numerous park visitors and requiring extensive emergency response from park personnel and local medical facilities. The severity of the victims' injuries remained unclear, though early reports suggested that the situation was life-threatening. Rachel Turner struggled to reconcile her positive experiences with grizzly bears during the day with the knowledge that someone else had suffered a tragic encounter with these same magnificent but dangerous predators. The emotional complexity of the situation highlighted the challenging balance between conservation goals and public safety that characterize wildlife management in areas like Glacier National Park. As night fell over northwest Montana, the three hiking companions found themselves connected not only by their shared adventure, but also by their involvement in a day that would likely be remembered as a defining moment in the ongoing story of human-wildlife coexistence in America's wilderness areas. Their positive experiences with bear encounters would be forever linked to the tragic circumstances that had developed elsewhere in the park. The news reports continued to evolve throughout the evening as additional details became available about the bear attack incident. Park officials had confirmed that a serious wildlife attack had occurred, but had not yet released detailed information about the circumstances or the condition of the victim. The lack of specific information only intensified public speculation and media coverage. Rachel spent a restless night processing the emotional complexity of her day's experiences, alternating between gratitude for her incredible wildlife encounters and distress about the unknown fate of the attack victim. The juxtaposition of positive and negative human-bear interactions within a single day had created a profound educational experience about the realities of wildlife conservation and wilderness recreation. The morning of May 22, 2025, brought additional details about the previous day's bear attack incident through official Park Service communications and expanded media coverage. The victim had been identified as a 19-year-old college student who had been hiking with a group on the Hidden Lake Trail when she had become separated and encountered a large male grizzly bear. Rachel Turner was shocked to learn that the attack had occurred on the same trail where she had spent her day observing bears safely from the elevated boardwalk. The proximity of the tragic incident to her own positive wildlife experiences created a profound emotional impact that would influence her perspective on wilderness recreation and conservation for the rest of her life. The official investigation into the bear attack would eventually reveal that the victim, a student named Jennifer Walsh from Montana State University, had violated multiple safety protocols by leaving her hiking group to photograph wildflowers in an area off the designated trail system. Her encounter with G417, the same large male grizzly that Rachel's group had observed safely from the boardwalk, had occurred when she surprised the bear while he was feeding in dense vegetation. The attack had been witnessed by several members of Jennifer's hiking group who had been unable to intervene effectively due to the speed and ferocity of the bear's response to being surprised at close range. Despite their attempts to use bear spray and noise to deter the animal, G417 had inflicted fatal injuries before retreating into the surrounding wilderness. The investigation would ultimately conclude that the tragic incident resulted from human error rather than abnormal bear behavior, as G417 had responded defensively to a surprise encounter in exactly the manner predicted by wildlife behavior research. However, the attack would generate significant controversy about grizzly bear management policies and public access to wilderness areas where large predators remained active. Rachel Turner's experience on the Hidden Lake Trail on May 21, 2025, had provided her with both the wonder of successful wildlife encounters and the sobering reality of wilderness risks. The lessons learned during her day with Sarah Hoffman, Marcus Chen, and Elena Rodriguez would influence her career in conservation biology and her lifelong commitment to promoting responsible wilderness recreation and wildlife conservation. The tragedy of Jennifer Walsh's death served as a reminder that sharing habitat with grizzly bears required constant vigilance, appropriate preparation, and respect for the power and unpredictability of wild predators. Rachel's positive experiences with bear encounters demonstrated that such coexistence was possible when proper protocols were followed, while Jennifer's fate illustrated the potentially fatal consequences of complacency or carelessness in bear country. The events of May 21, 2025, would be remembered as both a celebration of successful human-wildlife coexistence and a tragic reminder of the risks inherent in wilderness recreation. For Rachel Turner and her companions, the day represented a transformative experience that highlighted both the rewards and responsibilities involved in conserving North America's remaining large predator populations in increasingly popular national parks. The official incident report would later document that at approximately 2:47 p.m. on May 21, 2025, Jennifer Walsh had left her designated hiking group on the Hidden Lake Trail boardwalk to photograph what she believed were rare alpine wildflowers approximately 30 yards from the elevated walkway. Her decision to venture into unmarked terrain alone violated multiple park safety regulations and ignored explicit warnings about grizzly bear activity in the area. Jennifer's hiking companions, fellow Montana State University students Mark Davidson and Ashley Coleman, reported that she had been taking photographs along the boardwalk throughout their morning ascent to Hidden Lake. Her enthusiasm for botanical photography had led to increasingly bold positioning as she sought better angles and more dramatic compositions. Despite their warnings about staying within designated areas, Jennifer had become progressively more adventurous in her approach to nature photography. The fatal encounter occurred when Jennifer, focused intently on her photography, approached within approximately 15 feet of G417, who had been resting in dense vegetation after his morning foraging activities. The bear's initial defensive response involved a charge designed to drive away the perceived threat, but Jennifer's panicked attempt to flee apparently triggered the predatory instincts that led to the fatal attack. Mark Davidson and Ashley Coleman witnessed the attack from their position on the boardwalk, but were unable to provide effective assistance due to the distance involved and the speed with which the encounter developed. Their attempts to deploy bear spray were ineffective due to wind conditions and the significant gap between their location and the attack site. Their screams for help attracted the attention of other hikers in the area, but no one was positioned to intervene meaningfully in the rapidly unfolding tragedy. The investigation conducted by Glacier National Park personnel and federal wildlife agencies would ultimately determine that G417's behavior throughout the incident was consistent with normal defensive and predatory responses exhibited by male grizzly bears when surprised at close range during the breeding season. The bear's actions, while tragic in their consequences, represented natural behaviors rather than abnormal aggression or habituation to human presence. Park officials emphasized in their final report that the Hidden Lake Trail had an exemplary safety record prior to May 21, 2025, with thousands of visitors annually experiencing successful wildlife viewing opportunities without incident. The elevated boardwalk system had been specifically designed to provide safe passage through grizzly bear habitat, while minimizing the likelihood of surprise encounters that could trigger defensive or aggressive behaviors. Jennifer Walsh's death represented the first fatal grizzly bear attack on the Hidden Lake Trail in the more than 50 years since the area had been developed for recreational access. The tragedy prompted extensive review of park safety protocols and public education programs, though investigators concluded that existing procedures would have prevented the incident if they had been properly followed. The aftermath of the attack included temporary closure of the Hidden Lake Trail pending completion of the official investigation and implementation of additional safety measures. When the trail was eventually reopened several weeks later, enhanced signage, increased ranger patrols, and mandatory bear safety briefings for all visitors reflected lessons learned from the tragic incident. For Rachel Turner, the knowledge that she had spent May 21, 2025, hiking the same trail where Jennifer Walsh lost her life, created a profound sense of survivor's guilt mixed with renewed commitment to wilderness safety education. Her positive experiences with grizzly bear encounters served as a reminder that coexistence with large predators was possible when appropriate precautions were maintained, while Jennifer's fate illustrated the potentially fatal consequences of violating established safety protocols. The tragedy also reinforced for Rachel the critical importance of the professional expertise provided by people like Elena Rodriguez and Sarah Hoffman, whose knowledge of wildlife behavior and safety management had ensured positive outcomes during their own encounters with G417. The contrast between their successful wildlife viewing experiences and Jennifer's fatal encounter highlighted the thin margin for error that characterized recreation in areas where humans and large predators shared habitat. In the months following the Hidden Lake Trail incident, Rachel would incorporate the lessons learned on May 21, 2025, into her academic studies and career preparation in conservation biology. Her first-hand experience with both successful and tragic human-bear interactions provided a foundation for understanding the complex challenges involved in wildlife management and wilderness recreation that would influence her professional work for decades to come. The memory of Jennifer Walsh's death would serve as a constant reminder to Rachel of the responsibility that came with her chosen career path in environmental conservation. Every policy recommendation, educational program, and management decision would be informed by the knowledge that small mistakes in judgment could have fatal consequences for both humans and wildlife in the interconnected ecosystems that she was committed to protecting. Marcus Chen's photographic documentation of May 21, 2025, would eventually become part of a traveling exhibition about human-wildlife coexistence that toured museums and educational institutions throughout North America. His images of successful bear encounters on the Hidden Lake Trail served as powerful tools for teaching responsible wilderness recreation while honoring the memory of Jennifer Walsh through positive examples of how humans and grizzly bears could share habitat safely when appropriate protocols were followed. Sarah Hoffman completed her doctoral dissertation on human-bear interactions with extensive reference to the events of May 21st, 2025, using both her successful observations of G417's natural behavior and the tragic circumstances of Jennifer Walsh's death to illustrate the critical importance of education, preparation, and adherence to safety protocols in areas where large predators remained active. Her research contributed to improved management strategies that would help prevent similar tragedies while maintaining public access to critical wildlife habitat. Elena Rodriguez continued her career as a park ranger at Glacier National Park, carrying forward the lessons learned from the Hidden Lake Trail incident to improve visitor education and wildlife management throughout her jurisdiction. Her professional response to the complex situations that developed on May 21st, 2025, demonstrated the critical role that trained personnel played in managing human-wildlife interactions in wilderness environments, where both conservation and public safety goals had to be balanced carefully. The events of May 21st, 2025, would ultimately be remembered as a defining moment in the ongoing story of grizzly bear conservation and wilderness recreation in North America. Rachel Turner's positive experiences with wildlife encounters provided a model for successful coexistence, while Jennifer Walsh's tragic death served as a sobering reminder of the respect and caution required when sharing habitat with one of the continent's most powerful predators. Together, these contrasting outcomes illustrated both the rewards and risks inherent in the effort to maintain viable populations of large carnivores in landscapes increasingly dominated by human activities and recreational demands. The next stories: the Libby Chapel Horror. The snow fell in thick, heavy flakes across the Kootenai River Valley on the evening of January 27, 2024, blanketing the small town of Libby, Montana, in a pristine white silence that would soon be shattered by screams that would haunt the community for generations. Pastor William Robert Hayes, a 61-year-old man whose weathered hands had built half the church pews himself and whose gentle voice had comforted 3 generations of grieving families, stood at the heavy oak doors of Grace Community Chapel, fishing through his coat pocket for the brass keys that had been his responsibility for the past 17 years. The chapel sat on a small rise at the edge of town, surrounded by towering ponderosa pines and Douglas firs that creaked ominously in the winter wind. Behind the modest wooden structure, dating back to 1952, lay the old cemetery where pioneers and loggers rested beneath weathered headstones, their names barely visible through decades of Montana winters. The building itself was humble but sturdy, constructed from local timber with a steep metal roof designed to shed the heavy mountain snows. A large wooden cross, hand-carved by Hayes himself during his first year as pastor, stood prominently above the entrance, illuminated by a single floodlight that cast long shadows across the snow-covered ground. Hayes had arrived in Libby in 2007, a widower seeking solace after losing his wife Margaret to cancer. He'd spent his early ministry years in larger congregations in Billings and Missoula, but something about this small logging community nestled in the Cabinet Mountains had called to him. Perhaps it was the way the morning mist rose from the Kootenai River, or how the mountains seemed to cradle the town in their protective embrace. More likely, it was the genuine warmth of people who faced life's hardships with quiet dignity and unwavering faith. Margaret Eleanor Hayes had been gone for 3 years when William accepted the call to Grace Community Chapel. They'd been married for 34 years, high school sweethearts who'd weathered the storms of seminary, early ministry struggles, and the heartbreak of being unable to have children of their own. Margaret had been the perfect pastor's wife, gracious, intelligent, with an uncanny ability to remember every parishioner's birthday, anniversary, and family crisis. Her battle with breast cancer had lasted 18 months, and William had watched helplessly as the woman who'd been his anchor slowly slipped away, her faith never wavering, even as her body failed. The congregation at Grace Community Chapel had become his second family. There was Dorothy Mae Fletcher, 73 years old, who'd been playing the organ since 1968 and still arrived every Sunday morning at 7:30 to practice hymns she could play in her sleep. Her arthritic fingers might stumble occasionally, but her heart never missed a beat. She'd lost her husband Carl to a logging accident in 1983 and had raised their 3 children alone, working at the post office and playing piano at the local bar on Friday nights to make ends meet. Dorothy had a sharp wit and an even sharper tongue when it came to gossip, but her loyalty to those she loved was absolute. Then there was James Robert Big Jim McCready, a 45-year-old former logger who'd found religion after nearly killing a man in a bar fight in 2003. Jim stood 6'4" and weighed 260 pounds, with hands like baseball mitts and a gentle heart that belied his intimidating appearance. He'd been sober for 15 years and credited Hayes with saving his life, though the pastor always deflected such praise. Jim worked as a mechanic now, fixing trucks and farm equipment, and served as the church's unofficial handyman and security presence. Sarah Elizabeth Kowalski, 32, taught 3rd grade at the local elementary school and had been struggling with her faith since her divorce 2 years earlier. She'd grown up Catholic, but found comfort in the non-denominational approach at Grace Community Chapel. Her 8-year-old daughter Emma attended Sunday school religiously, finding in Hayes the grandfather figure she'd never had. Sarah's parents had died in a car accident when she was in college, and her ex-husband's drinking and verbal abuse had left her wary of trusting anyone completely. Hayes had spent countless hours listening to her fears and helping her rebuild her confidence. The Hendricks family formed the backbone of the church's younger generation. Mark and Jennifer Hendricks, both 38, had moved to Libby from Seattle 5 years earlier, seeking a simpler life for their twin sons, Tyler and Trevor, now 14. Mark worked as a forest ranger, and his knowledge of local wildlife made him one of Hayes's closest confidants when it came to understanding the increasing bear activity in the area. Jennifer homeschooled the boys and coordinated the church's food pantry, which served nearly 40 families during the harsh winter months. Dr. Patricia Ann Morrison, 57, was the town's only physician and had delivered half the babies in the valley over the past 25 years. She'd been raised Methodist, but appreciated Hayes's inclusive theology and practical approach to faith. Her husband, Robert, owned the hardware store, and together they'd become pillars of the community. Patricia had been the first to notice Hayes's increasing fatigue over the past few months, though she'd attributed it to the stress of winter ministry and his habit of working too hard. The Yazzie family represented the growing Native American presence in the congregation. Joseph Yazzie, 41, was half Blackfeet and worked as a hunting guide, while his wife Maria, 39, taught at the tribal school on the reservation 30 miles south. Their 3 children, Michael, 16, Jessica, 13, and little Joseph Jr., 8, brought energy and laughter to every service. Joseph's deep knowledge of bear behavior had made him invaluable to local authorities, and he'd often warned Hayes about the increasing grisly activity near the cemetery. Elderly couple Harold and Mildred Thompson, ages 79 and 76 respectively, had been married for 54 years and never missed a Sunday service. Harold had worked the mines before they closed, and Mildred had been a telephone operator back when such jobs existed. They lived in the same house Harold had built in 1971, and their 4 grown children visited regularly from various cities across the Northwest. The newest member of the congregation was 24-year-old Rebecca Ann Sullivan, a recent college graduate who'd come to Libby to work as a social worker for the county. She'd been raised in a strict evangelical household and found Hayes's gentle theology refreshing after years of fire and brimstone preaching. Rebecca was still finding her place in the small community, but had quickly bonded with Sarah Kowalski over their shared experiences of starting over. Local businessman Frank Wheeler, 63, owned the town's largest construction company and had donated materials for most of the church's recent renovations. His wife Carol sang in the choir and organized the annual church picnic. Frank was known for his generosity and quick temper, traits that had served him well in business, but sometimes created tension in the more diplomatic world of church politics. The final core member was Reverend Thomas Mitchell, 71, the pastor emeritus who'd served Grace Community Chapel for 32 years before Hayes's arrival. Mitchell lived in a small apartment behind the church and still helped with Wednesday night Bible study and hospital visits. His memory was starting to fade, but his wisdom remained sharp, and Hayes often sought his counsel on difficult pastoral matters. On this particular evening, January 27, 2024, the temperature hovered at 18 degrees Fahrenheit, with a wind chill that made it feel closer to zero. The National Weather Service had issued a winter storm warning for the region, predicting another 8 to 12 inches of snow overnight. Most residents had battened down for the storm, but several parishioners had attended the Saturday evening service despite the weather. Hayes had concluded the service at 7:15, about 15 minutes earlier than usual due to the deteriorating conditions. The service had been well attended considering the weather. 37 people gathered to hear his sermon on faith during difficult seasons, taken from Isaiah 43:2. When you pass through the waters, I will be with you, and when you pass through the rivers, they will not sweep over you. When you walk through the fire, you will not be burned. The flames will not set you ablaze. Dorothy Fletcher had stayed after to discuss music for the upcoming Easter service, still 2 months away, but requiring early planning for special arrangements. She'd noticed Hayes seemed more tired than usual, with dark circles under his blue eyes and a slight tremor in his hands that she attributed to too much coffee and not enough sleep. "Pastor Bill," she'd said, using the nickname he'd acquired among the congregation, "you need to take better care of yourself. Margaret wouldn't want you working yourself into the ground." Hayes had smiled at the mention of his late wife, as he always did. "She'd probably tell me to delegate more and trust the Lord to handle the details," he'd replied, straightening the hymnals in the pews with the methodical care he brought to everything. "But you know how it is, Dorothy. Sometimes the work just needs doing." Big Jim McCready had lingered after Dorothy left, ostensibly to check the furnace, but really to spend a few minutes with the man who'd become his spiritual father. Jim had been struggling with his teenage daughter's rebellion lately. She'd been caught drinking at school and had announced her intention to drop out at 16. Hayes had listened patiently as Jim wrestled with anger and disappointment, offering gentle guidance without judgment. "She's testing boundaries," Hayes had said, placing a weathered hand on Jim's massive shoulder. "It's what kids do. The fact that she can push back means she feels safe enough to express herself, even if she's going about it the wrong way. Keep loving her, Jim. Don't let your fear make you push her away." By 7:45, only a few stragglers remained. The Hendricks family had left quickly due to the weather, Mark expressing concern about the roads. The twins had been excited about the prospect of a snow day, chattering about sledding and snowball fights until their mother reminded them they still had homework to finish. Sarah Kowalski had departed with Emma, who'd been fighting a cold all week and needed to get home to bed. Dr. Morrison had paused at the door to remind Hayes about his upcoming physical, scheduled for the following Thursday. "Don't you dare cancel on me again, Bill," she'd said with mock sternness. "I've been trying to get you in for a complete checkup for 6 months. At our age, we can't afford to ignore our health." Hayes had promised faithfully to keep the appointment, though privately he'd been dreading it. He'd been experiencing occasional chest pains and shortness of breath, symptoms he'd been attributing to stress and the high altitude. The truth was, he'd been afraid to learn what might be wrong, afraid that a serious diagnosis might force him to leave the congregation he'd come to love so deeply. The last to leave had been Rebecca Sullivan, who'd stayed to help fold the bulletins for Sunday's service and organize the children's craft supplies. She'd been quiet throughout the evening, and Hayes had sensed something troubling her. "Everything all right, Rebecca?" he'd asked as they stacked chairs in the fellowship hall. She'd hesitated before answering, her young face creased with worry. "I've been having doubts," she'd admitted finally, "about faith, about God, about whether any of this makes sense. I know that's probably not what you want to hear from a new member." Hayes had set down the chair he'd been lifting and given her his full attention. At 61, he'd counseled enough people to know that doubt was often the beginning of deeper faith, not its enemy. "Doubt isn't the opposite of faith, Rebecca," he'd said gently. "It's faith asking hard questions. The people who worry me are the ones who never question anything. What's prompting these feelings?" She'd talked for nearly 20 minutes about her struggles with reconciling her faith with the suffering she encountered in her social work. The children who endured unthinkable abuse, the families torn apart by poverty and addiction. Hayes had listened without trying to fix or explain, simply bearing witness to her pain and uncertainty. "I don't have easy answers," he'd said finally. "If I did, they probably wouldn't be worth much. But I've learned that faith isn't about having all the answers. It's about being willing to keep asking the questions, even when, especially when, they're difficult ones." By 8:27 p.m., Hayes found himself alone in the chapel for the first time that evening. The building creaked and settled around him, familiar sounds that usually brought him comfort. Tonight, however, he felt an unusual sense of unease, though he couldn't put his finger on why. Perhaps it was the storm, or the cumulative effect of several challenging pastoral conversations over the past week. Mrs. Henderson had been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, the Kowalski divorce had finalized with bitter custody disputes, and the church's aging furnace had been acting up, creating concern about heating bills they could barely afford. He moved through his closing routine with practiced efficiency, checking that all windows were latched, ensuring the coffee pot in the kitchen was unplugged, and making sure no candles remained lit in the sanctuary. The wooden floors creaked beneath his boots as he made his rounds, the sound echoing in the empty space. Outside, the wind had picked up considerably, rattling the windows and causing the metal roof to flex and pop with temperature changes. Hayes paused at the small table near the altar, where prayer requests were collected each week. The pile had grown larger lately, reflecting the community's ongoing struggles with economic hardship, health issues, and family conflicts. He whispered a quiet prayer for each family represented, a habit he'd developed during his first year in Libby. It was during these quiet moments that he felt closest to his calling, away from the administrative demands and interpersonal conflicts that sometimes threatened to overshadow the spiritual aspects of his work. The chapel's heating system cycled on with a mechanical wheeze, blowing warm air through vents that rattled slightly in their mountings. Jim McCready had been promising to tighten those screws for months, but there never seemed to be enough time for all the small maintenance tasks the aging building required. Hayes made a mental note to mention it again, then immediately chastised himself for his tendency to micromanage. Jim was reliable and thorough. The vents would be fixed when he had time. At 8:35 p.m., Hayes finally approached the front doors, keys in hand. The brass ring held 7 keys: the main entrance, the fellowship hall, his office, the storage closet, the cemetery gate, and 2 spares for emergency situations. He'd carried these keys for over 17 years, and they'd become as familiar as a rosary, worn smooth by countless handlings. Margaret used to tease him about his attachment to those keys, saying he treated them like sacred artifacts. The main door's lock had been sticking lately, requiring a specific technique to engage properly. Hayes inserted the key and jiggled it slightly while applying gentle pressure, a dance he'd perfected through trial and error. The mechanism clicked into place with a satisfying thunk, and he tested the handle to ensure it was properly secured. Outside, the storm had intensified significantly since the service ended. The wind howled through the pine trees with a sound like rushing water, and the snow fell so thickly that Hayes could barely make out his pickup truck parked 20 feet away. The single floodlight that illuminated the church entrance created a cone of swirling white that extended perhaps 15 feet before disappearing into the darkness beyond. Hayes pulled his wool coat tighter around his neck and tugged his knit cap down over his ears. At 61, he felt the cold more acutely than he had in his youth, and the arthritis in his hands made his joints ache in weather like this. His breath formed white clouds in the frigid air as he stood for a moment on the covered porch, listening to the storm and watching the snow accumulate on the railings. The cemetery gate was visible from where he stood, though barely. The wrought iron entrance was maybe 40 feet away, partially obscured by the swirling snow and the shadows cast by the towering evergreens that surrounded the burial ground. Hayes had always felt a sense of responsibility for the cemetery, even though it was technically owned by the county rather than the church. He'd spent countless hours over the years maintaining the grounds, clearing fallen branches, and ensuring the headstones remained readable. Many of the graves dated back to the early 1900s, when Libby was a booming logging town. There were entire family plots filled with children who'd died of influenza, miners who'd perished in accidents, and women who'd died in childbirth far from modern medical care. Hayes had researched many of their stories over the years, feeling it was important to remember these souls who'd helped build the community. Some of the more recent graves held people he'd known personally and whose funerals he'd conducted. Carl Fletcher, Dorothy's husband, rested beneath a simple granite marker near the old oak tree. The Andersons' infant son, who'd lived only 3 days, lay in the children's section under a lamb-shaped stone. These were the graves Hayes visited most often, bringing flowers from the church garden in summer and ensuring snow was cleared from the walkways in winter. As he stood on the porch, Hayes noticed something that made him pause. The cemetery gate, which he was certain he'd locked after Thursday's funeral service, appeared to be standing slightly ajar. It was difficult to tell for certain through the heavy snow, but something about the angle caught his eye. He'd developed an almost obsessive attention to security details over the years, partly due to occasional vandalism problems, and partly because he felt responsible for protecting this sacred space. Hayes debated whether to investigate immediately or wait until morning. The rational part of his mind argued that trudging through 6 inches of fresh snow in near blizzard conditions was foolish for a man his age. The wind chill was brutal, and he was already tired from the long day. If the gate was open, it had probably been that way for hours, and waiting until daylight wouldn't make much difference. But the responsible part of his personality, the part that had made him an effective pastor for 3 decades, wouldn't let him ignore a potentially serious security issue. If teenagers were using the cemetery as a gathering place again, as they had 2 summers ago, it was better to address the situation immediately rather than let it escalate. Plus, if animals had gotten in and disturbed any graves, the families deserved to know as soon as possible. Hayes sighed and stepped off the porch into the storm. The snow was deeper than he'd expected, immediately spilling over the tops of his boots and soaking his socks with cold water. Each step required effort as he broke through the crusty surface layer into the softer snow beneath. The wind hit him like a physical blow, driving snow into his face and making his eyes water instantly. The path to the cemetery gate, which he'd walked thousands of times over the years, was completely obscured by the storm. Hayes navigated by memory and the occasional glimpse of familiar landmarks: the corner of the fellowship hall, the old birch tree that marked the halfway point, the stone retaining wall that bordered the church property. His progress was slow and laborious, and within minutes he was breathing heavily from the exertion. As he approached the gate, his suspicions were confirmed. The wrought iron barrier stood open by perhaps 18 inches, enough for a person to slip through sideways. The lock mechanism appeared intact, which ruled out vandalism or break-in attempts. More likely, someone had failed to secure it properly after the last funeral, or the wind had worked it loose over several days of storms. Hayes reached for the gate to close it properly when a sound made him freeze. It was subtle, barely audible above the wind, but unmistakably organic. A low huffing sound, like a large animal breathing heavily. His first thought was that someone's dog had gotten loose and taken shelter in the cemetery, though it seemed unlikely given the weather conditions. He peered into the darkness beyond the gate, trying to make out shapes among the headstones and monuments. The cemetery covered approximately 2 acres, with mature evergreen trees scattered throughout and a small maintenance shed at the far end. Visibility was limited to perhaps 10 feet in the swirling snow, making it impossible to see much detail. The sound came again, closer this time, and accompanied by what might have been the scrape of claws on stone. Hayes felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. His experience in Montana had taught him to recognize the signs of large wildlife, and something about this situation felt wrong. Bears should have been hibernating by now, especially given the harsh winter conditions. But climate change had been disrupting normal patterns for years. Mark Hendricks had mentioned during their last conversation that several grizzlies had been spotted in the valley unusually late in the season. One large male had been particularly problematic, getting into garbage cans and showing little fear of humans. The state wildlife officials had been tracking the animal, hoping to tranquilize and relocate it before it caused serious problems. Hayes backed away from the gate slowly, his heart rate increasing as his survival instincts kicked in. He'd lived in bear country long enough to know the basic rules: never run, avoid direct eye contact, make yourself appear as large as possible, and back away slowly while speaking in calm, low tones. The problem was that he had no idea where the animal might be, or whether it had already noticed his presence. "Easy now," he whispered into the wind, unsure if he was talking to himself or to whatever creature lurked beyond the gate. "Everything's fine. Nobody's bothering anybody." He'd taken perhaps 3 careful steps backward when he heard a sound that made his blood freeze, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from multiple directions at once. It was a sound he'd heard only once before, during a hiking trip in Glacier National Park 15 years earlier, when he and Margaret had accidentally gotten between a mother grizzly and her cubs. That encounter had ended peacefully when they'd slowly retreated to a safe distance, but the memory of that primal, terrifying sound had never left him. Hayes continued his backward retreat, fighting every instinct that screamed at him to turn and run. His feet slipped in the snow, and he had to windmill his arms to maintain balance. The church was only 40 feet away, but in the deep snow and treacherous footing, it might as well have been 40 miles. Each step seemed to take an eternity, and the weight of unseen eyes watching him from the darkness was almost unbearable. The growling stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence that was somehow more terrifying than the sound had been. Hayes had read enough about predator behavior to know that absolute quiet often preceded an attack. His breathing became rapid and shallow, and he could feel sweat forming beneath his winter clothes despite the freezing temperature. 20 feet from the church porch, Hayes made a critical mistake. His foot caught on something hidden beneath the snow, probably the edge of the walkway or a decorative border stone, and he stumbled forward, catching himself on his hands and knees. The impact drove snow up his sleeves and down the front of his coat, but more importantly, it put him in an extremely vulnerable position. The attack came with shocking suddenness and violence. Hayes heard the sound of heavy paws pounding through the snow behind him, accompanied by huffing breaths and low snarls. He managed to push himself to his feet and take 2 lurching steps toward the church before something massive slammed into his back, driving him face first into the snow. The impact knocked the wind from his lungs and filled his mouth and nose with snow. He felt claws rake across his back, tearing through his heavy coat as if it were tissue paper. The weight pressing down on him was enormous, easily 400 pounds or more, and the smell was overwhelming, a combination of wet fur, decay, and something primal and wild that his hindbrain recognized as mortal danger. Hayes tried to roll over, to protect his face and throat, but the animal's weight held him pinned. He could hear its breathing just inches from his head, could feel hot breath on his neck. Terror gave him strength, and he managed to buck upward, throwing the creature off balance long enough to flip onto his back. What he saw above him would haunt him for the rest of his life, however long that might be. The grizzly bear was massive, probably a mature male, weighing close to 500 pounds. Its fur was dark brown, almost black in the stormlight, and matted with snow and ice. The head was enormous, with small, intelligent eyes that reflected the distant floodlight like burning coals. The mouth was slightly open, revealing yellow teeth the size of a man's thumb. But it was the expression that struck Hayes most forcefully. Not the mindless rage of a rabid animal, but something cold and calculating, as if the bear were making deliberate choices about how to proceed. This was not a defensive attack by a startled or frightened creature. This was predation. The bear reared up on its hind legs, towering nearly 8 feet tall, and roared with a sound that seemed to shake the very ground. The noise was deafening, drowning out even the howling wind, and Hayes felt certain it could be heard for miles. Surely someone would come to investigate, he thought desperately. Surely Big Jim McCready or one of the other parishioners would hear and come running. But Libby was a small town where people minded their own business, and the storm would muffle sounds and keep everyone indoors. Hayes realized with growing horror that he was completely alone with this apex predator, with no weapon, no help, and no realistic chance of escape. The bear dropped back to all fours and began circling Hayes slowly, never taking its eyes off him. Hayes tried to remember everything he'd ever been told about surviving bear attacks. Play dead for defensive attacks, fight back against predatory attacks. But how do you tell the difference when you're flat on your back in the snow with a 500-pound carnivore deciding whether to kill you quickly or slowly? "Please, God," Hayes whispered, the words barely audible above the storm. "Please help me. Not like this. Not here." The bear seemed to hear the prayer and reacted with what could only be described as annoyance. It huffed loudly and took a step closer, lowering its massive head until its nose was inches from Hayes's face. The pastor could see individual snowflakes caught in the animal's fur, could smell the carrion on its breath, could see his own terrified reflection in its dark eyes. Time seemed suspended in that moment. Hayes thought of Margaret, waiting for him in whatever came after this life. He thought of his congregation, who would find his body in the morning and struggle to understand how their God could allow such a senseless tragedy. He thought of all the sermons he'd preached about faith in times of trouble and wondered if those words would prove true when his own faith was tested to its absolute limits. The bear's first deliberate attack came without warning. It lunged forward and clamped its jaws around Hayes's left shoulder, the teeth punching through his heavy coat, wool sweater and flannel shirt as if they were made of paper. The pain was immediate and overwhelming, unlike anything he'd ever experienced. It felt as if molten metal had been poured into his shoulder. and he screamed with a voice he didn't recognize as his own. The bear shook him like a dog worrying a toy, lifting him partially off the ground and slamming him back down repeatedly. Hayes could feel bones breaking, could hear the wet sounds of tissue tearing, could taste blood filling his mouth. His vision went white with pain, and for a moment he thought he might lose consciousness. But consciousness remained, cruel and unwavering, forcing him to experience every detail of his destruction. The bear released his shoulder and immediately grabbed his right arm, its jaws easily encompassing his forearm. Hayes felt the radius and ulna snap like twigs, and his hand went completely numb. He tried to punch the animal with his left arm, but his strength was already ebbing with blood loss and shock. Through his agony, Hayes became aware of voices in the distance. Someone was shouting, though the words were indistinguishable through the storm and his own screaming. The bear heard them too, and lifted its head, looking toward the church with ears pricked forward. For a moment, Hayes dared to hope that rescue was coming, that somehow he might survive this nightmare. Dorothy Fletcher had been driving home from the service when she'd realized she'd left her purse in the church kitchen. Despite the storm, she turned around and made the treacherous drive back, her ancient Honda struggling through the deepening snow. She'd seen Hayes's truck still in the parking lot and had wondered why he was staying so late in such terrible weather. She'd been halfway to the church entrance when she'd heard the first scream, a sound so primal and terrifying that it had stopped her in her tracks. Dorothy had worked as a nurse for 40 years before retiring, and she knew the sound of mortal agony when she heard it. Her first instinct had been to run back to her car and call for help, but something deeper had compelled her forward. When she'd rounded the corner of the church and seen the enormous bear mauling Pastor Hayes in the snow, Dorothy Fletcher had done something that would amaze everyone who knew her quiet, reserved nature. She'd started screaming at the top of her lungs while running toward the attack, waving her arms and making as much noise as possible. "Get away from him! Get away! Help! Somebody help!" The bear looked up from its victim, blood staining its muzzle, and fixed Dorothy with a stare that made her knees weak. For several seconds, that felt like hours, the three of them formed a grotesque tableau: the predator, its dying prey, and the elderly woman who'd stumbled into a nightmare. Hayes managed to turn his head enough to see Dorothy, and the sight of her brave, foolish face gave him strength he didn't know he still possessed. "Run," he gasped, the word barely audible through his damaged throat. "Dorothy, run, get help." But Dorothy Fletcher hadn't survived 7 decades in Montana by being easily intimidated. She grabbed a dead pine branch from the ground. It was perhaps 3 feet long and thick as her wrist, and continued advancing on the bear, shouting and waving the makeshift weapon. "You leave him alone, you hear me? Leave him alone." The bear's reaction was swift and decisive. It abandoned Hayes and charged toward Dorothy with a speed that seemed impossible for something so large. She had perhaps 2 seconds to realize the magnitude of her mistake before 500 pounds of muscle and fury slammed into her, driving her to the ground with bone-crushing force. Dorothy's scream cut through the night like a blade, and Hayes watched in horror as the bear began mauling the woman who'd tried to save him. The attack on Dorothy was even more vicious than his own had been, as if the animal were punishing her for her interference. Blood sprayed across the white snow in arterial spurts, dark against the pristine surface. But Dorothy's sacrifice had accomplished something crucial. Her screaming had alerted others to the emergency. Lights were coming on in houses throughout the valley, and Hayes could hear the distant sound of sirens beginning to wail. The volunteer fire department and EMTs were responding, though they'd faced the same treacherous driving conditions that had nearly prevented Dorothy from returning. Big Jim McCready had been at home, settling in for the evening with his wife and rebellious teenage daughter, when he'd heard what he later described as the worst sounds I've ever heard in my life. Living only 3 blocks from the church, he'd grabbed his deer rifle and headed out into the storm without stopping to call for backup or even put on a coat. Jim's arrival at the scene was like something from a movie. He'd crashed through the snow and around the church building to find the massive grizzly standing over Dorothy Fletcher's motionless form, blood covering its face and paws. Hayes was 20 feet away, trying to crawl toward the church despite his horrific injuries. "Hey!" Jim roared, raising the rifle to his shoulder. "Hey, you bastard!" The bear turned toward this new threat, and for a moment Jim felt his resolve waver. He'd hunted black bears before, but this grizzly was larger than any animal he'd ever seen in the wild. Its eyes held an intelligence that was somehow more frightening than simple animal rage. This wasn't a creature acting on instinct. It was a predator that had made deliberate choices and would continue to make them. Jim fired without hesitation, the rifle crack echoing through the storm. His shot took the bear high in the shoulder, spinning it around and eliciting a roar that seemed to shake the very foundations of the church. But rather than retreating, the wounded animal charged directly toward him, covering the 20-foot distance with shocking speed. Jim managed to work the bolt action and fire a second shot before the bear reached him. This bullet struck center mass, but the grizzly's momentum carried it forward, and Jim found himself fighting for his life with an animal that should have been dead, but refused to acknowledge that fact. The bear's initial swipe caught Jim across the chest, his shirt and jacket offering no protection against claws that opened 4 parallel furrows from his shoulder to his sternum. The impact threw him backward into the snow, but his size and strength allowed him to roll aside as the bear's jaws snapped shut where his head had been a second before. More sirens were approaching now, and the sound seemed to infuriate the bear further. It stood over Jim, blood streaming from its wounds, and roared defiance at the night sky. Jim rolled frantically, trying to get his rifle into position for another shot, but the weapon had been knocked from his hands and lay somewhere in the trampled snow. The bear's next attack never came. Another rifle shot cracked through the storm, fired from somewhere near the church parking lot. The bullet struck the grizzly in the head, dropping it instantly in a lifeless heap that pinned Jim's legs beneath its massive weight. Joseph Yazzie emerged from the darkness like an avenging spirit, his hunting rifle still smoking in the frigid air. As a guide and tribal member, he'd been tracking this particular bear for weeks, following reports of increasingly aggressive behavior and livestock kills. He'd arrived at the church in response to the emergency calls and had taken the shot that finally ended the nightmare. "Are you hit?" Joseph called to Jim, struggling through the deep snow to reach the injured man. "I'm okay," Jim gasped, though blood was soaking through his shirt and he could feel the bear's weight pressing down on his legs. "Check on Pastor Hayes and Dorothy. I think they're hurt bad." The next 20 minutes passed in a blur of organized chaos as emergency responders flooded the scene. The volunteer fire department arrived first, followed closely by the county sheriff's deputies and the EMTs. Portable floodlights were set up, turning the blood-soaked snow into a surreal crime scene that would be photographed and analyzed for weeks to come. Dr. Patricia Morrison had ignored all protocol and driven to the scene in her own vehicle, rather than waiting for the ambulance to transport victims to the hospital. She'd worked triage situations before, but nothing had prepared her for the carnage she found behind Grace Community Chapel. Dorothy Fletcher was unconscious and in critical condition, having suffered massive trauma to her torso and arms. Her pulse was weak and thready, and she'd lost an enormous amount of blood. Dr. Morrison started 2 IV lines and began pushing fluids while directing the EMTs in preparing her for transport. "She needs surgery immediately," Morrison told the lead EMT. "Radio ahead and tell them we're coming in with massive trauma. They need to have the OR ready." Hayes was conscious, but in severe shock, his face grey with blood loss and his breathing shallow and rapid. His left shoulder was destroyed, hanging at an unnatural angle, and his right arm was clearly broken in multiple places. Worse, there were signs of internal injuries, His abdomen was becoming distended, suggesting internal bleeding. "Pastor Hayes, can you hear me?" Dr. Morrison asked, shining a penlight into his eyes to check for signs of concussion. "Dorothy," Hayes whispered, his voice barely audible. "How is Dorothy?" "She's alive," Morrison replied, which was technically true, though it dodged the question of whether she'd remain that way. "We're going to take good care of both of you. Just try to stay calm and conserve your strength." Big Jim McCready had suffered the least serious injuries of the three victims. Though his chest wounds required immediate attention and his legs were bruised and possibly fractured from being pinned under the bear, he refused to be loaded onto a stretcher until he'd seen Hayes and Dorothy safely into ambulances. The grizzly bear lay where it had fallen, its massive bulk steaming in the cold air as body heat dissipated into the night. Joseph Yazzie estimated its weight at close to 500 pounds, making it one of the largest grizzlies ever recorded in the region. The animal's claws were over 4 inches long, and its teeth showed signs of advanced age, which might have explained its willingness to attack humans rather than pursuing more traditional prey. Sheriff's deputies cordoned off the scene while wildlife officials were summoned to examine the bear and determine what had caused its aggressive behavior. The attack would trigger a complex investigation involving multiple agencies, from local law enforcement to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. As the ambulances pulled away from the church, their red and blue lights disappearing into the storm, the full magnitude of what had occurred began to sink in for the first responders and witnesses. In less than 10 minutes, a peaceful Saturday evening in small-town Montana had become a scene from a horror movie, leaving 3 people fighting for their lives and a community traumatized beyond comprehension. The storm continued to rage throughout the night, but inside the warm confines of Libby General Hospital, a different kind of battle was beginning. Dr. Morrison had called in every available surgeon and specialist within driving distance, knowing that the next few hours would determine whether her friends and parishioners lived or died. Dorothy Fletcher was rushed immediately into surgery, where Dr. James Reeves, the hospital's chief surgeon, began the delicate process of repairing the massive damage inflicted by the bear's claws and teeth. Her left arm had been nearly severed at the elbow, held in place only by tendons and a few strips of muscle. Her ribs were broken on both sides and one lung had been punctured. "Jesus Christ," Reeves muttered as he examined the extent of her injuries. He'd been a trauma surgeon for 25 years, had served in Iraq during his military service, but he'd never seen anything quite like this. How is she still alive? The surgical team worked through the night, performing multiple procedures to stabilize Dorothy's condition. The arm would have to be amputated below the elbow. There was simply too much tissue damage to save it. The lung was repaired, the broken ribs were stabilized, and massive transfusions replaced the blood she'd lost in the snow behind the church. In a second operating room, Pastor Hayes underwent emergency surgery to repair internal bleeding and address his shoulder injuries. The bear's teeth had done enormous damage, crushing bones and severing muscles and tendons. Dr. Sarah Kim, an orthopedic surgeon who'd driven down from Kalispell despite the storm, worked for 6 hours to reconstruct what remained of his shoulder joint. "I can save the arm," she told Dr. Morrison during a brief break between procedures, "but he'll never have full function again. The nerve damage is extensive, and some of those tendons can't be repaired." Hayes had also suffered significant blood loss and was showing signs of kidney failure, complications that would require ongoing intensive care. His age worked against him. At 61, his body's ability to recover from such trauma was limited compared to a younger victim. Big Jim McCready's injuries, while painful and requiring surgery to repair his chest wounds, were not life-threatening. He'd insisted on staying awake during treatment so he could provide information to investigators and check on the condition of his fellow victims. "That bear wasn't acting normal," he told Sheriff Robert Davis, who'd come to the hospital to gather initial statements. "I've hunted bears before, and they don't usually attack like that. It was like it was hunting us, specifically. Joseph Yazzie had arrived at the hospital shortly after the ambulances, still carrying his rifle and covered in the bear's blood from helping to move its carcass. As the only person at the scene with extensive knowledge of bear behavior, his observations would be crucial to understanding what had happened. It was an old male, he explained to the gathered officials, probably 20 years old or more, based on the wear on its teeth and claws. My guess is it was having trouble hunting normal prey due to age or injury and had turned to easier targets. Dr. Patricia Morrison had essentially taken over as incident commander for the medical response, coordinating between the various specialists and keeping the victims' families informed of their conditions. She'd known all 3 victims for years, and the professional detachment required for effective emergency medicine was difficult to maintain. Dorothy made it through surgery, she told the group of parishioners who'd gathered in the waiting room, despite the late hour and dangerous driving conditions. She's in critical condition, but she's stable. Pastor Hayes is still in surgery, and Jim is going to be fine. The waiting room had filled with members of the Grace Community Chapel congregation, despite the fact that it was now nearly 2 in the morning and the storm was still raging outside. Mark and Jennifer Hendricks had left their twins with neighbors and driven to the hospital. Sarah Kowalski had arranged childcare for Emma and was pacing the halls with barely controlled anxiety. The Yazzies, the Thompsons, Frank and Carol Wheeler, virtually the entire congregation, had somehow made it to the hospital to support their injured pastor and fellow parishioners. Dr. Morrison looked at these people. Farmers and loggers, retirees and young families united by their faith and their love for 3 people fighting for their lives down the hall, and felt a profound sense of both grief and admiration. This was what community looked like in its purest form, she realized. When crisis struck, everything else fell away except the bonds that truly mattered. At 3:47 a.m. on January 28, 2024, Dr. Sarah Kim emerged from the operating room where she'd been working on Pastor Hayes. She was exhausted, having driven through treacherous conditions and then performed complex surgery for over 6 hours, but her expression was cautiously optimistic. "He's stable," she announced to the waiting congregation. "The shoulder reconstruction went better than expected, though he'll need additional surgeries down the road. The internal bleeding is controlled, and his vital signs are improving." A collective sigh of relief echoed through the waiting room, followed immediately by bowed heads and whispered prayers of thanksgiving. Rebecca Sullivan, the young social worker who'd been struggling with her faith just hours earlier, found herself weeping with relief and surprise at the intensity of her emotions. Dorothy Fletcher remained in intensive care, sedated and on a ventilator, but alive. The amputation of her left arm had been successful, and the other repairs were holding. Dr. Reeves cautioned that the next 72 hours would be critical, but he was cautiously optimistic about her chances for survival. Big Jim McCready was released from surgery at 4:15 a.m., his chest wounds cleaned and sutured, his ribs wrapped, and his legs x-rayed and cleared of fractures. He'd insisted on staying at the hospital until he knew the condition of the other victims, and he'd become an unofficial spokesman for the group, providing updates to family members and coordinating with law enforcement. As dawn began to break over the Kootenai River Valley, on January 28th, the storm finally began to subside. The snow had stopped falling, and weak sunlight filtered through the overcast sky, illuminating a landscape transformed by the night's events. The area behind Grace Community Chapel remained cordoned off with crime scene tape, the blood-stained snow providing stark evidence of the violence that had occurred just hours earlier. The grizzly bear's carcass had been loaded onto a flatbed truck and transported to the State Wildlife Laboratory in Bozeman for a complete necropsy. Initial examination had revealed an old male in generally poor health, with arthritis in its joints and several old injuries that might have impaired its ability to hunt normal prey. Tissue samples would be tested for diseases, including rabies, though the animal's behavior suggested something more complex than simple illness. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a wildlife biologist with Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks, had driven through the night from Helena to examine the scene and coordinate the investigation. She'd seen the aftermath of bear attacks before, but the systematic nature of this assault was unusual and troubling. Most bear attacks on humans are defensive, she explained to Sheriff Davis as they surveyed the scene in daylight. A mother protecting cubs, or an animal surprised at close range. This looks different, more predatory in nature. The bear didn't retreat when confronted by multiple humans, which is highly abnormal behavior. The investigation would eventually reveal that the grizzly had been supplementing its diet with human garbage for several weeks, gradually losing its natural fear of people. Climate change had disrupted normal hibernation patterns, keeping some bears active later into the winter season. The combination of factors had created a perfect storm of circumstances that led to the tragic confrontation. Media attention began to focus on Libby almost immediately. By Sunday morning, news crews from Missoula, Spokane, and even Seattle were making the difficult drive into the valley, drawn by the dramatic story of a small-town pastor mauled by a grizzly bear outside his own church. The image of the wooden cross illuminated against the blood-stained snow would become iconic, appearing on front pages across the region. The story resonated far beyond Montana's borders, tapping into deeper cultural anxieties about the intersection of faith and wilderness, civilization and nature. Conservative media outlets portrayed it as a symbol of Christian persecution by an indifferent natural world. Environmental groups used it to highlight the ongoing conflicts between human development and wildlife habitat. Local residents just wanted the reporters to go away and leave them to grieve in peace. Pastor Thomas Mitchell, the elderly pastor emeritus, had been awakened by phone calls in the early hours of Sunday morning and had immediately driven to the hospital. At 71, and with declining health of his own, he'd rarely been more needed by his congregation. The Sunday morning service would have to go on, despite the absence of Pastor Hayes, and someone needed to help the community process what had happened. "We'll gather this morning as planned," he told the assembled parishioners at 6 a.m., his voice steady despite his exhaustion. "We'll pray for Bill, for Dorothy, for Jim, and for the wisdom to understand why God allows such trials in our lives. Most of all, we'll remember that our faith isn't based on circumstances, but on something deeper and more permanent." The Sunday service was unlike anything Grace Community Chapel had ever experienced. The sanctuary was packed beyond capacity, with people standing along the walls and spilling into the fellowship hall. Many attendees weren't regular churchgoers, but had come seeking comfort and community in the wake of tragedy. The mood was somber, but not defeated, more like a family gathering strength to face an uncertain future. Dorothy Fletcher's daughter Patricia had driven overnight from Portland, arriving at the hospital just as the morning shift change was taking place. She'd been estranged from her mother for several years, following a bitter divorce and custody dispute, but those differences seemed insignificant now as she sat beside the intensive care bed, holding her mother's remaining hand. "I'm here, Mum," she whispered to the sedated figure surrounded by monitors and tubes. "I'm not going anywhere. You're going to get through this." Dr. Morrison had slept only 2 hours in the on-call room before returning to check on her patients. Dorothy's condition remained stable, but critical. The amputation site was healing well, but her body was still in severe shock from blood loss and trauma. The next few days would tell whether she'd developed any infections or organ complications. Pastor Hayes was conscious for the first time since surgery, though heavily sedated for pain management, When Dr. Morrison entered his room, his first words were predictably selfless. "How is Dorothy?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper through his damaged throat. "She's fighting," Morrison replied honestly, "just like you are. Jim is doing well. He'll probably go home tomorrow. You need to focus on your own recovery now." Hayes tried to nod, but found the movement too painful. His left shoulder was immobilized in a complex brace system that would be his companion for months to come. The nerve damage was extensive, and while Dr. Kim had been able to save the arm, its function would be permanently limited. "The congregation," Hayes whispered. "Sunday service." "Tom Mitchell is handling everything," Morrison assured him. "The church is full of people praying for all of you. You don't need to worry about anything except getting better." But worry was an occupational hazard for pastors, and Hayes spent the morning fretting about details that others were perfectly capable of managing. Who would conduct Wednesday night Bible study? Was the furnace still acting up? Had anyone remembered to salt the walkways before people arrived for service? These concerns might have seemed trivial to an outside observer, but they represented something deeper. Hayes's profound sense of responsibility for his flock and his difficulty accepting that others could shoulder that burden, even temporarily. It was the same impulse that had driven him into the storm to check on the cemetery gate, the same dedication that had made him an effective pastor for 3 decades. Big Jim McCready was discharged from the hospital Sunday afternoon against Dr. Morrison's recommendations. His chest wounds were painful and would require weeks of healing, but he insisted on returning home to his family and checking on the church property. The attack had left him shaken in ways he was only beginning to understand. "I keep thinking about that bear," he told his wife as they drove slowly through town. "The way it looked at me, like it was deciding whether I was worth killing. I've never seen anything like that before." Jim's experience had been traumatic in ways that went beyond physical injury. He'd always prided himself on being tough and capable, someone others could count on in a crisis. But facing the grizzly had shown him his own mortality in stark terms, and he was struggling to reconcile his self-image with the reality of how helpless he'd felt in those terrifying moments. His teenage daughter, who'd been giving him nothing but trouble for months, surprised everyone by being uncharacteristically gentle and attentive after his return from the hospital. Seeing her father injured had apparently provided perspective on their conflicts, reminding her that life was fragile and relationships precious. The wildlife investigation was proceeding rapidly, with officials eager to determine what had caused such aberrant behavior in the grizzly. Tissue samples had been rushed to the State Veterinary Diagnostic Laboratory, and preliminary results suggested no obvious diseases or abnormalities. The bear appeared to have been a healthy, if aging male, that had simply made poor choices about food sources and human interactions. Dr. Walsh interviewed dozens of residents about recent bear sightings and encounters, gradually building a picture of an animal that had been habituating to human presence for weeks before the fatal encounter. Garbage cans had been raided, pets had gone missing, and several people had reported seeing a large bear near residential areas during daylight hours. All warning signs that had been overlooked or dismissed as normal wilderness encounters. "This could have been prevented," Walsh confided to Sheriff Davis as they reviewed the timeline of events. "If people had been more aggressive about securing garbage and reporting sightings, we might have been able to intervene before it escalated to this level." But hindsight was always clearer than foresight, and the residents of Libby had been living alongside bears for generations without serious incident. The attack at Grace Community Chapel represented a convergence of factors that no one could have predicted with certainty. Joseph Yazzie had become an unexpected hero in the aftermath, praised for his quick thinking and accurate shooting. But he took no satisfaction in killing the bear, viewing it as a necessary but tragic end to a situation that had spiraled out of control. As a hunting guide and tribal member, he understood better than most the delicate balance between humans and wildlife in Montana. "Bears aren't evil," he told a reporter from the Daily Interlake. "They're just doing what bears do, trying to survive. This one made some bad choices, but that doesn't make it a monster. It makes it a wild animal that got confused about boundaries." The church community was struggling to make sense of the attack in theological terms. How could a loving God allow such violence to occur on sacred ground to people who dedicated their lives to serving others? Pastor Mitchell addressed these questions during his sermon on Sunday, drawing on decades of experience counseling people through crisis. "I don't know why this happened," he said honestly, his voice carrying across the packed sanctuary. "I don't know why God allowed Bill and Dorothy and Jim to suffer as they have. What I do know is that our faith isn't based on having all the answers. It's based on trusting that there's meaning and purpose even in the midst of suffering we can't understand." The congregation found comfort in Mitchell's honesty and wisdom, but many continued to wrestle with their own doubts and fears. Rebecca Sullivan, the young social worker who'd been questioning her faith just days earlier, found herself oddly strengthened by the tragedy. Seeing Dorothy Fletcher risk her life to help another person had provided a powerful example of faith in action, even in the face of overwhelming odds. Medical updates continued to dominate conversations throughout Libby. Dorothy remained in intensive care but was showing signs of improvement. Her vital signs were stabilizing, and she'd regained consciousness briefly on Monday morning. The amputation site was healing without signs of infection, and doctors were cautiously optimistic about her overall prognosis. Pastor Hayes faced a longer and more complicated recovery process. His shoulder injuries would require multiple surgeries and months of physical therapy, and there was no guarantee he'd ever regain significant use of his left arm. The psychological trauma was equally challenging as he wrestled with survivor's guilt and replayed the attack endlessly in his mind. "I keep thinking about Dorothy," he told Dr. Morrison during one of her visits. "She didn't have to come back. She didn't have to try to help me. And now she's lost her arm because of my mistake." "You didn't make a mistake," Morrison replied firmly. "You were doing your job, checking on church property. Dorothy made a choice to help, just like Jim made a choice to come running when he heard trouble. That's what people do for each other here. They help, even when it's dangerous." But Hayes couldn't shake the feeling that he bore responsibility for the injuries to his parishioners. It was a burden he'd carry long after his physical wounds healed, a weight that would influence every aspect of his ministry going forward. The media attention was becoming intrusive, with reporters camping outside the hospital and approaching congregation members for interviews. Sheriff Davis had to assign extra deputies to manage the crowds and protect the privacy of the victims and their families. The story had captured national attention, spawning think pieces about religion, wildlife management, and the challenges of rural life. Most coverage was respectful, focusing on the heroism displayed by ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances. But some outlets sensationalized the story, portraying it as evidence of God's judgment or nature's revenge against human encroachment. These interpretations angered local residents who felt their tragedy was being exploited for political or ideological purposes. Tuesday brought encouraging news about Dorothy Fletcher's condition. She'd been taken off the ventilator and was breathing on her own, a major milestone in her recovery. Her first words upon waking were characteristically sharp. "Well, this is a fine mess, isn't it?" Her daughter Patricia laughed through her tears, recognizing the sardonic humor that had always been her mother's way of coping with adversity. Dorothy was going to survive, though her life would be forever changed by the loss of her arm and the trauma she'd endured. "At least I won't have to worry about playing piano anymore," Dorothy told Dr. Morrison with typical pragmatism. "Maybe it's time for someone else to take over the music ministry." But even as she joked about her limitations, Dorothy was already planning her return to church activities. The attack had been traumatic, but it hadn't broken her spirit or diminished her faith. If anything, surviving such an ordeal had strengthened her resolve to make the most of whatever time she had left. Pastor Hayes's recovery was progressing more slowly, complicated by his age and the severity of his injuries. The shoulder reconstruction had been successful, but the rehabilitation process would be long and painful. Physical therapists were already working with him on range of motion exercises, preparing for the months of work ahead. More challenging than the physical rehabilitation was the emotional healing required after such trauma. Hayes was experiencing nightmares, flashbacks, and anxiety that made it difficult to concentrate or rest effectively. Dr. Morrison had referred him to a trauma counselor, but Hayes was reluctant to admit he needed psychological help. "I've counseled people through crisis for 30 years, he told his wife's sister, who'd driven up from Bozeman to help with his care. "I should be able to handle this myself." But trauma didn't respect professional expertise or personal faith, and Hayes gradually began to understand that healing would require accepting help from others, a lesson that would prove valuable in his ongoing ministry. Big Jim McCready was healing physically, but struggling emotionally with what he'd witnessed and experienced. The attack had triggered memories of his violent past, reminding him of feelings and impulses he thought he'd overcome through faith and sobriety. He found himself jumpy and irritable, startling at sudden noises and losing his temper over minor frustrations. His wife encouraged him to talk to Pastor Mitchell about these struggles, but Jim was embarrassed by what he saw as weakness. He'd always been the strong one, the protector, the man others turned to when things got tough. Admitting that he needed help felt like a betrayal of that identity. The investigation into the bear attack was nearing completion, with officials preparing their final report for release to the public. The grizzly had been confirmed as a healthy 22-year-old male that had been supplementing its diet with human garbage for several weeks before the attack. Climate disruption had delayed its hibernation, and habituation to humans had eliminated its natural caution. Dr. Walsh's report would include recommendations for improved garbage management, enhanced public education about bear behavior, and more aggressive intervention protocols for problem animals. The attack had been preventable, but only through community-wide changes in behavior that would require ongoing vigilance and cooperation. Wildlife officials were also grappling with broader questions about grizzly bear management in northwestern Montana. The population had been recovering steadily for decades, leading to more frequent encounters with humans as suitable habitat became scarce. Balancing conservation goals with public safety would require ongoing dialogue and adaptive management strategies. Thursday marked 1 week since the attack, and Grace Community Chapel held a special prayer service for the 3 victims. The sanctuary was packed once again, with people traveling from throughout the region to show support for the small congregation that had faced such tragedy. Pastor Mitchell led the service, drawing on scripture and personal experience to help the community process their trauma and find meaning in suffering. He spoke about the difference between understanding and accepting, acknowledging that some questions might never have satisfactory answers while still maintaining faith in divine purpose. "We may never understand why Bill and Dorothy and Jim had to suffer as they did," Mitchell said, his voice strong despite his advanced age. "But we've seen something beautiful emerge from this tragedy. We've seen a community come together. We've seen ordinary people display extraordinary courage, and we've been reminded of what really matters in life." The service included testimonies from congregation members about how the attack had affected their faith and their understanding of community. Rebecca Sullivan spoke about finding strength in Dorothy's example of selfless service. The Hendricks twins talked about their new appreciation for their parents and the fragility of life. Even some non-churchgoers shared how the tragedy had prompted them to reconsider their priorities and relationships. Friday brought more encouraging news about Pastor Hayes's recovery. He'd been moved from intensive care to a regular room and was beginning to show signs of his old personality. His first visitors were Mark and Jennifer Hendricks, who found him sitting up in bed and asking detailed questions about church finances and the condition of the furnace. "Some things never change," Jennifer laughed, pleased to see Hayes worrying about mundane administrative details. "The furnace is fine, the bills are paid, and Tom Mitchell has everything under control. You just focus on getting better." But Hayes's mind was already turning toward the future and his return to ministry. The attack had changed him in ways he was still discovering, but it hadn't diminished his sense of calling or his love for his congregation. If anything, surviving such trauma had deepened his appreciation for the preciousness of life and relationships. Dorothy Fletcher was making remarkable progress in her recovery, showing the toughness that had carried her through decades of rural Montana life. She'd begun working with occupational therapists to learn new ways of performing daily tasks with one hand, approaching the challenges with characteristic determination and humor. "I've been doing everything with two hands for 73 years, she told her therapist. "I guess it's time to learn some new tricks. Maybe I'll take up painting or something equally ridiculous." Her daughter Patricia had decided to extend her stay in Libby indefinitely, recognizing that her mother would need ongoing support during her recovery. The crisis had helped heal their relationship, providing perspective on the disagreements that had kept them apart for too long. The second week after the attack brought a return to something approaching normalcy in Libby, though the community remained forever changed by what had occurred. Church attendance at Grace Community Chapel had increased dramatically, with many new faces appearing in the pews. Some came out of curiosity, but many stayed because they found genuine community and comfort among people who demonstrated such resilience in crisis. Big Jim McCready had finally agreed to counseling sessions with Pastor Mitchell, beginning to work through the trauma he'd experienced and its connection to his violent past. The attack had triggered difficult memories and emotions, but addressing them honestly was helping him find new strength and understanding. "I thought faith was supposed to make you fearless," he admitted during one session, "but maybe it's really about finding courage even when you're afraid." Mitchell nodded, recognizing wisdom born from hard experience. "Courage isn't the absence of fear, Jim. It's doing what's right, despite being afraid. You proved that when you ran toward danger to help your friends." The wildlife investigation had concluded with a comprehensive report that would influence bear management policies throughout the region. The attack had been a tragic but predictable result of human-bear conflicts that were becoming more common as both populations expanded and climate change disrupted natural patterns. Media attention was finally beginning to subside, allowing the community to grieve and heal without constant scrutiny. The story had served its purpose in highlighting important issues about wildlife management and rural safety, but the people most affected by the tragedy were ready to move forward with their lives. 3 weeks after the attack, Pastor Hayes received clearance to leave the hospital and continue his recovery at home. The church had arranged for round-the-clock care and had made modifications to his small house to accommodate his limitations. His homecoming was celebrated with a parade of visitors bearing casseroles, flowers, and heartfelt wishes for his recovery. Hayes found the transition to home both comforting and challenging. Familiar surroundings provided emotional healing, but they also triggered memories of the night when his life had changed forever. He could see the church from his bedroom window, including the area where the attack had occurred, now marked only by some disturbed snow and the absence of the large pine tree that had been damaged during the rescue operation. Dorothy Fletcher's discharge came 2 days later, after nearly a month in the hospital. She'd mastered many one-handed techniques and had been fitted with a prosthetic arm, though she joked that she felt like a cyborg from one of those science fiction movies the kids watch. Her return home was equally celebrated, with the entire congregation taking turns, providing meals and assistance with daily tasks. Dorothy's house had also been modified for accessibility, with grab bars in the bathroom and ramps over the front steps. These changes had been paid for through donations from throughout the valley, demonstrating the community's commitment to caring for their own. The first Sunday when both Hayes and Dorothy attended church together was an emotional milestone for the entire congregation. Hayes's left arm remained in a sling, and Dorothy wore her prosthetic proudly, but their presence in the sanctuary represented triumph over tragedy and the resilience of human spirit. Pastor Hayes delivered his first sermon since the attack, speaking from Psalm 23 about walking through the valley of the shadow of death and fearing no evil. His voice was stronger than expected, though he tired easily and had to sit down several times during the service. "I've walked through that valley literally," he told the packed sanctuary. "I've felt the presence of evil and experienced the reality of death. But I've also felt the presence of God in the courage of friends who risked everything to help me, in the skill of medical professionals who put me back together, and in the love of a community that refused to let tragedy defeat them." The congregation wept openly as Hayes described his experience, finding catharsis in shared emotion and common faith. The attack had been traumatic for everyone, not just the direct victims, and hearing their pastor speak honestly about fear and faith provided healing for the entire community. Dorothy Fletcher's first public appearance was equally moving. She'd insisted on playing the organ for the service, despite having to learn new techniques with her remaining hand and the prosthetic. The music wasn't perfect, but it was heartfelt, and her determination to continue serving despite her limitations inspired everyone present. "I'm not going to let some overgrown teddy bear keep me from doing what I love," she announced to the congregation, earning laughter and applause, "though I might need to find some simpler hymns for a while." The healing process would continue for months and years to come. Pastor Hayes faced ongoing physical therapy and would never regain full use of his left arm. Dorothy's adaptation to life with a prosthetic was challenging, requiring patience and practice to master simple tasks she'd previously taken for granted. Big Jim continued working through trauma counseling, learning to integrate his experience into his ongoing recovery from addiction and violence. But the attack had also revealed strengths and connections that might never have been discovered otherwise. The congregation at Grace Community Chapel had been welded together by shared crisis, creating bonds that would endure for generations. New members had been drawn to a community that had demonstrated such authentic love and mutual support. Regional wildlife management had been improved through lessons learned from the attack, potentially preventing similar tragedies in other communities. Public education about bear safety had been enhanced, and protocols for dealing with problem animals had been refined based on this experience. Most importantly, 3 people who'd faced death and emerged forever changed had found ways to transform their trauma into wisdom and their suffering into service. Their story would be told and retold throughout the Kootenai River Valley, becoming part of the community's collective memory and identity. 6 months after the attack, Pastor Hayes was able to resume many of his regular duties, though with accommodations for his physical limitations. His preaching had gained depth and authenticity from his brush with mortality, and his counseling of others facing crisis carried new authority born from personal experience. Dorothy Fletcher had become an advocate for amputees throughout Montana, speaking at hospitals and rehabilitation centers about adaptation and acceptance. Her prosthetic arm had become a badge of honor rather than a source of shame, and her example inspired others facing similar challenges. Big Jim McCready had channeled his experience into a new ministry, working with other men struggling with anger and violence. His story of finding courage in crisis resonated with people seeking their own paths toward healing and redemption. The cemetery behind Grace Community Chapel had been redesigned with better lighting and security measures, though it remained a place of peace and reflection for the community. A small memorial stone marked the location where the attack had occurred, bearing the inscription, "In every trial, God provides a way," along with the names of the 3 survivors. The grizzly bear that had changed so many lives was remembered not as a monster, but as a wild creature whose natural instincts had been disrupted by human activity. Its death had served as a catalyst for improved coexistence between humans and wildlife throughout the region. 1 year after the attack, Grace Community Chapel held a special service of remembrance and thanksgiving. The sanctuary was fuller than ever, with people who'd been drawn to the community by its example of resilience and mutual support. Pastor Hayes, Dorothy Fletcher, and Big Jim McCready each spoke about how the tragedy had ultimately deepened their faith and strengthened their relationships with each other and with God. "We didn't choose what happened to us that night," Hayes said in his anniversary sermon, "but we did choose how to respond to it. We chose to support each other, to find meaning in suffering, and to allow our wounds to become sources of wisdom rather than bitterness." The story of the Libby Chapel Horror, as the media had dubbed it, continued to resonate throughout Montana and beyond. It had become a parable of sorts, illustrating themes of courage, community, faith, and redemption that spoke to universal human experiences. But for the people who'd lived through it, the attack was less about symbolism than about the daily work of healing and helping others do the same. They'd learned that survival was only the beginning of recovery, that trauma could be transformed into wisdom, and that even the worst experiences could ultimately serve purposes larger than themselves. The small wooden chapel continued to stand on its hill overlooking the Kootenai River Valley, its hand-carved cross illuminated each evening as a beacon for travelers passing through the darkness. Behind it, the cemetery held its silent vigil over the dead, while before it, the living gathered each week to worship, to remember, and to find strength for whatever challenges lay ahead. In the end, the Libby Chapel Horror became less about the terror of that snowy January night than about the love, courage, and faith that emerged from it. 3 people had faced death and lived to tell about it, and their story had become part of something larger, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the power of community to transform tragedy into triumph. The bear was gone, but the bonds forged in its shadow would endure for generations, a legacy of light emerging from darkness in the heart of the Montana wilderness.